Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Edelgard of the Rebellion in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 1, The Queen of Flames. 300 years have passed since the ascension of Nemesis to the throne of God Emperor and his war of unification. Ravaged by war, the world of Fodlan was rebuilt into the crown jewel of the Empire. Built upon the ashes of the old world, the megacity New Fodlan serves both as a reminder of the Empire's power and the elevation of humanity's status with the use of technology. But progress comes at a cost, and for every citizen basking in the favor of the Empire there are two more scrambling to survive another day. Those that are weak are cast aside, and those that are cast aside are forgotten. That is the will of the God Emperor Nemesis, and his will is law. In the depths of New Fodlan, a young woman lives a double life. By day she basks in the opulence granted to her by the God Emperor. By night, she takes up her blade and wages a shadow war against the Empire and its magistrate. She fights for her own vengeance, and for the sake of the future, because she is the only one that can. For her, there is only one man left standing at the end of the road, the God Emperor Nemesis, and for the sake of her family she will have his head. But on one fateful day a routine operation goes awry, and she soon finds that not all is as it seems. Status report, Casper. Visual confirmation that target is moving northbound 6 clicks from your location. You should be free to engage, boss. Bernadetta. No interference so far from the skies. You should be okay. Understood. Moving in. Edelgard von Hresvelg sat atop her parked hoverbike, staring at the metallic folds of her mask. The matte black titanium alloy did not shine in the sunlight, though the red one-way composite that made up the mask's face certainly did. She twirled it around in her fingers. Servos and actuators inside whirred, as if itching to activate to go from mask to helmet. It was strange. Every time she put the mask on she felt as if she was losing a part of Edelgard, the little girl that both had it all and lost it all. But when she donned the mask and helmet of the Queen of Flames, it was the only time she felt truly alive. Through the red of the visor she could see her own face tinted in a brilliant shade of crimson. Her eyes were weary, and her skin had certainly lost the vitality it had in the years past. Her hair was frayed and messy, and as time passed it seemed to be losing its luster as well, the price she had paid unwillingly for power. But her own physical comfort was a small price to pay for striking a blow against the magistrate, and as her opponent was an empire that spanned the solar system every little bit counted. She took a deep breath, and pressed the mask to her face. Instantly the back of the mask extended outwards in a cascading shudder, becoming a helmet as it covered her platinum white hair. The seal on the bottom engaged as the servos whirred, sealing the helmet with the rest of her suit with a hiss of air. The red visor that made up the front of her mask flared to life, lines of code streaming past her eyes before finally lighting to form a proper HUD. All systems nominal, a robotic voice intoned. Connection established. Welcome, Queen of Flames. Diagnostics ran up and down her screen before disappearing into the crevasses of her helmet, leaving only the darkness of the world projected onto her visor. And with that, whatever was left of Edelgard disappeared beneath the mask. Only the Queen of Flames remained, she who would tear the world asunder and build it anew. She leaned forward on the seat of her hoverbike and disengaged the parking brake, forcing it to life. The grav engines flared to life with a low roar, oscillating and then stabilizing at a high frequency until it was no more than a quiet purr. The parking stabilizers disengaged, and the hoverbike gently lifted off of the concrete until it was about half a foot in the air. Helmet bike link established. All of the metrics of the hoverbike now appeared on her visor, and so she had a full readout of her new bike's capabilities. Linhard certainly did not disappoint, especially when it came to the Heavering 3000. Though she had paid a pretty penny for his help, Edelgard knew that to make an impact as a self-proclaimed queen she would have to also make an impression. The flashy white hoverbike certainly did not hurt, even if it did cost an arm and a leg to get. Her gauntlet fingers squeezed the throttle, and with barely any shaking the bike shot forward as the back engine activated. Soon the overpass that she had been hiding under gave way to the light of the world above. Sunset rays fell upon her in brilliant shades of orange and yellow as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a good omen. The advent of dusk meant that if her contacts were correct, then she would be perfectly placed to intercept the shipment. On her visor, a cluster of bright red triangles flashed ahead. This was most certainly the convoy that they were intercepting, as little traffic was on the highway between Galatea and Remire at this time of day. Scattered about were blue triangles. These were her mercenaries, ready to intercept whenever she engaged. As much as she wanted to sightsee and see the sprawling world of Newfoundland around her, Edelgard's eyes were on the prize. Just barely she could make out the distinct silhouette of an APC and its escorts rumbling through the highway at a little under 100 miles an hour. She was going about twice that, though a speeding ticket was the least of her worries in the moment. There was the bounty on her shoulders, the list of crimes attributed to her alter ego as the Queen of Flames, and of course, there was the nature of her true identity. The intel Gerald had given her suggested that they were transporting something important in the APC that necessitated a full magistrate escort. Of course he had not been willing to shoulder the risk, but she had. The Queen of Flames was risking a lot intercepting a heavily guarded convoy such as this one, but if the reports were true, then it was worth enough to protect with a whole platoon of enforcers. All she had to do was find out what it was, and even if it wasn't important to her, if the magistrate wanted it that badly, she certainly wanted it out of their hands. As the convoy came up into full view, she weighed her options. The sky above was a bit cloudy, and the setting sun gave each wisp an eerie glow of ethereal flames. But the pertinent part was that it was clear of aircraft, which was a good thing. The main concern she had was air support, though her IFF radar told her that no helicopter or hovercraft had been dispatched to escort the convoy. And since whatever was being transported was in a ground convoy, it must have been quite fragile, because otherwise it would have been shipped through a cargo plane. A person? Edelgard mused to herself. But all that for a single VIP, multiple? It could also be vials of heaven. Or a cryogenic chamber. Contact, a voice buzzed in her helmet over magistrate channels. Unidentified vehicle, approaching at 200 miles an hour. She was lucky Bernadetta was on her side. The little operator had cracked the encryption of the magistrate's enforcement division with a combination of clever social engineering and code backdoors. 2 days of effort was all Bernadetta needed to gain a trove of insight into the enforcers through their comms, and it was effort that did not go unappreciated by Edelgard. Of course, more pertinent information was restricted to Class G communication lines, but she could at least make do knowing where the enforcers were relative to her own location. Identify yourselves, an enforcer ordered over an open channel. You are approaching a convoy of the magistrate. If you do not comply, you will be met with lethal force. Lovely. She remained silent. Bring the hoverbike down, crackled someone else over the line. So much for the path of least resistance. She heard the telltale whirring of a plasma cannon spinning up, and she jerked the handlebars sideways. It was not a moment too soon, because as she swerved to her left a jet of ionized energy shot from a small turret on top of one of the escort vehicles and scorched the swath of road where she had just been. Edelgard sped up to dodge a shot that just barely clipped her head. She smelled ozone, one of the telltale lingering traces of an energy weapon. Traditional firearms had long since fallen out of favor, ever since the introduction of hollow projection that created shields capable of stopping a bullet. Improvements in material science meant that her current armor was also capable of shrugging off gunfire with ease. Only other energy weapons could present a threat, mostly coming in the form of melee weapons. It was almost ironic how in the future mankind had returned to waging war with sword and shield. In Edelgard's case, however, she favored an axe. As she approached the rear of the convoy, she mentally picked out the truck with the plasma cannon and swerved straight toward it. As she approached on its left, Edelgard reached towards the utility belt on her suit. Her fingers curled around a familiar baton-like black weapon. With a quick flick of her wrist, she held it outwards and away from her body, perpendicular to the bike. That triggered a series of cascading servos and slides, all of which were meant to extend the baton into a proper handle. Sections split and extended outward, telescoping until it was 3 times its original length. Metal plates folded in on themselves, and 2 emitters uncovered themselves at the end of the handle. Combat, Edelgard whispered to no one in particular except for her helmet. The blades of the holocs flared to life, glowing a transparent red that eventually hardened into the outline of a double-headed axe blade. With that, she slowed her hoverbike slightly as she pulled to the side of the armed truck. Dimly she was aware of a series of plasma bolts being fired, but they were too poorly aimed to do anything. With one mighty swing she cleaved the wheels clean off of the truck, speeding up so that her strike covered the entire length of the vehicle. It began to wobble before finally falling onto the broken metal that was left, slowing down and leaving a trail of sparks behind before finally coming to a stop a good distance away. Perfect. 1 down, 8 to go. The next vehicle up ahead was a standard Enforcer sedan. That went down without much resistance as she cut a jagged path through the front left wheel and into the engine block. This is Escort Delta 347, requesting backup. I repeat, requesting AAAH. The communication cut off as the car burst into flames, careening off the road in an uncontrolled skid. Now that the left side had fallen, she could work on the primary target. The armored personnel carrier was meant to be completely surrounded by its escort vehicles, but now it was unguarded on its left side. Still, she couldn't cut through the armored plates as easily as she had with the other vehicles, and there was also the issue of the energy cannon raining fire on her from the rear window of the patrol car in front of her. With a flourish of her left hand she activated the hollow shield in her left gauntlet. A wall of red manifested on her wrist, which she extended to cover the front of her hover bike. The golden beams popped and fizzled as they made contact with her energy shield. With that out of the way, she deactivated her shield temporarily and reached for her utility belt to find a small disc. Slowing down to maintain speed with the convoy, she pulled up to the side of the armored personnel carrier and leaned to her right. Edelgard then flicked her left wrist and released her fingers so that the disc passed underneath the vehicle and attached to it with a small thunk. Peering through the tinted glass, she could faintly see a man in a suit with a blonde handlebar mustache calling someone. The two made eye contact for a brief second, before his eyes bulged and began frantically dialing someone else. A governor of sorts? He seemed quite familiar for some reason. Ah. So they were transporting a VIP. Not that I'm in the mood for taking hostages, but it'll have to do for now. Edelgard waved at the poor man through the window. Then she braked, engaging the front thrusters to slow her as fast as possible to make distance between her and the convoy. The disc detonated, launching the car several feet in the air and flipping it in the process. The explosive blast was far enough to not affect her, though it did shake her bike a bit. The armored personnel vehicle sailed through the air, decelerating before landing on the highway with a loud crash. It slowed to a stop as it skidded on its roof, leaving a black mark on the road. Target secured, she spoke into her comms. Looks like a VIP escort. Casper. Both teams are moving to target, about maybe a minute out. Sucks that it's just a guy, though. Where's all the loot? Keep the comms chatter to a minimum, she chided. Eyes on the prize. Several feet to the APC's left, Edelgard slowed her bike down to a complete stop and left it hovering. She approached the fallen vehicle, only to find a blade barring her path. The sword glowed a dim shade of orange, the sign that it was one of the Enforcer's standard-issued heated blades. The hand that gripped it was connected to a man in white and blue armor, topped with the unmistakable outline of an Enforcer helmet. A black visor hid any hint of humanity beneath glass, though she guessed there certainly was someone giving her a death glare underneath. To provide backup, two more came approached, probably from the patrol car that had just arrived on the scene. These two drew their swords, surrounding Edelgard from her front and right sides. So, this is the Queen of Flames, he said through his helmet. In the name of the God Emperor, hands above your head. We should just kill her, said another. Do you know how much her bounty is? I do like the sound of a promotion, finished the last one. He had the insignia of a captain emblazoned brightly on his chest, either a testament to his skill or his connections. Did you think stopping a convoy of the magistrate would be easy? No, Edelgard replied in a modulated voice. But killing you will be. In the blink of an eye she moved. The first strike was with surgical precision. She lashed forward with her hallux and aimed for the sword of the first Enforcer, clashing in a series of sparks as she forced him backwards. He had time to shout in surprise and raised his blade to intercept, which was exactly what she wanted. The sound of metal grinding on metal pierced the silence of the afternoon as Edelgard forced her axe upwards to knock him off balance. He stumbled in surprise as Edelgard kicked him squarely in the chest with the force of a speeding car. He flew backwards from the impact and into the side of the armored car, denting the metal with a loud thunk and leaving a trail of blood behind his slumping body. She whirled around to her left just in time to catch the sword of the second enforcer with her hollow shield. This one was not so lucky either. She easily deflected the enforcer's attack and brought her axe down in a smooth motion. That left a bloody gash across the enforcer's armor, which prompted a response from the approaching enforcer captain. Both enforcers swiped at her, a single lunge for the captain followed by a downward slash from the second enforcer. Edelgard took the opportunity to deftly sidestep and bring her axe in one sweeping horizontal motion, which the two also dodged. All she had to do was isolate one of them, which she found the opportunity when one of them brought a sluggish blade in a low sweep. She used the opportunity to leap over it and bring her axe into a downward motion. Without the enforcer's blade to block, it was already over. She delivered a fatal strike to the enforcer's helmet that split it in two. The woman inside fell down unceremoniously in a pool of her own blood. The captain shouted something incomprehensible and charged. His sword was quick, and delivered some small nicks to her armor in a flurry of attacks. But they were both caught by the black and red plates on her armor that covered the bodysuit underneath, made of a composite resistant to heat weaponry. Edelgard whirled around, using the momentary distraction of her cape flourishing in the air to knock the man off of his feet with a low leg sweep. There was a feeling of bone cracking as her augmented strength met his body. The price of power was quite high, but it was certainly a price she was willing to pay if she could leverage it to win. He fell backwards on his rear end, and to finish him off she swung her hollowks in a wide arc through the man's chest. Where there was once body armor came a splatter of red onto the road, and with a small grunt of effort she wrenched her axe free from his broken insides and brought it to her side. Shame to ruin some perfectly good uniforms, she mused. Even if it bears the cursed insignia of the magistrate's lapdogs. Continuing her approach to the APC, she approached slowly, kicking over the enforcer's body that lay slumped next to the passenger door. She peered inside, only to find no one there. In the smoky distance, she could dimly see a blonde-haired man in a suit running as if his life depended on it. That was certainly the passenger that they were trying to escort. As if to add to her misfortune, the escort convoy finally managed to arrive in time. Though she had bought a bit of time by blowing up the car and forcing them to turn around, now she was facing a platoon's worth of enforcers. They filed out and began to approach her in a neatly organized formation, swords, lances, and axes all raised in a wordless threat. She didn't see any plasma cannons activated on the vehicles, but they were still a threat in great numbers. Edelgard knew that if she tried to chase down the VIP she might put herself in a disadvantageous position. She might have been able to make mincemeat of 3 enforcers, but several dozen on her own. That was too much risk for her to bear. Luckily she was not exactly alone. Right on time, crackled somebody over her communication line. Caspar Bergles burst out onto the scene from the side of the road, taking one poor enforcer by surprise as he slammed his fist into their skull. His power gauntlets hissed with blue energy as he delivered a second blow to make sure they were down before moving on to the next target. 12 more of her mercenaries appeared. They must have used the sparse vegetation on the side of the road to make their entrance undetected. Some she recognized, and some she did not. In their motley assortment of armor and weapons they looked more like a ragtag group than the well-trained fighters she knew them to be. But they would do for now. They wasted no time. In the blink of an eye, several enforcers went down, while the rest surged forward to replenish their ranks. She watched as the girl known as Flesh drove 2 daggers into a man twice her size, and spotted one of her men impaling an enforcer with an electric lance. The rigidity of the enforcer formation quickly turned into an all-out melee as she watched the sparks fly. Still, while they were some of the finest fighters New Fodlands Underground had to offer, most of them fought selfishly and for themselves without discipline. The initial surprise of an ambush soon wore off, and now some of the enforcers began to put up a good amount of resistance. And she no longer had eyes on the VIP. He had probably fled into an enforcer vehicle amidst the madness. Edelgard was several feet away, and she pondered whether or not to let them have their fun or to enter the fray herself. The answer, as it soon turned out, came from her helmet. "BB boss," said a familiar voice on a private channel. "What is it, Bernadetta?" "Most of the escorts here, but one of the trucks peeled off and didn't stop." "What do we, do? Is it getting help?" "I don't think so." "Understood." She barely registered a spluttered objection echoed over the radio as she racked her brain. Why would one of the trucks just leave an escort mission? It couldn't be a mutiny or a hijacking, there was no evidence for that. Cowardice was also out of the question, considering that was a crime punishable by death. And the primary directive of an escort was to protect the VIP at all costs, and every resource fleeing the scene meant one less resource in battle. It made no sense, especially considering how unceremoniously the man in the car vanished. Surely there should have been a dozen enforcers guarding his path to the vehicle awaiting his exit. Unless. Her eyes widened beneath her visor. The primary directive is that truck, the rest is simply a distraction. It's a demmed decoy operation. She switched her line to the main comms and addressed her mercenaries. I'm in pursuit of a secondary target. Take what you can, and get out before it gets too hot. Casper, you're on point. Roger, he grunted as she heard the telltale sound of a skull cracking beneath his fists. Breaking out into a full sprint, Edelgard swept her left leg upwards and leapt onto the back of her hoverbike that had been a dozen feet away seconds ago. She clenched the throttle hard enough for the metal to bend slightly, lurching her into a forward motion as she shot past the battle entirely. The acceleration shot her body backwards, but she maintained her posture leaning forward on the handlebars. A couple plasma shots whizzed by her head, and a few more dotted the road in front. She swerved to easily dodge them from reaction alone. All that mattered was catching up to the rogue truck as the accelerometer inched glaringly close to the red zone. On her radar, a couple blue triangles appeared that were dimmer than the rest. This suggested the presence of air support, though Edelgard did not yet know if they were chasing her or her men. Still, the telltale lack of any missile radar lock-ins meant that she was in the clear for now. As the hoverbike raced forwards with a low purr, it struck her just how much she enjoyed riding. In her youth it had been a simple electric bike, in her years of teenage rebellion it was a vintage motorcycle, and now it was a state-of-the-art hoverbike prototype that certainly could beat out anything the magistrate had to offer. The feeling of the wind blowing through her hair, well, that certainly was a moot point considering her helmet, but she could certainly feel a bit of the wind through her body armor. The sheer adrenaline she had when racing through the highway at breakneck speeds, the feeling of braking 200 miles an hour, it certainly was something. It was the only time she felt truly free. The world seemed so serene as the flat road gave way to a raised overpass that overlooked the district of Inver. The residential district shone with opulence, with high buildings spread out amongst a landscape of grand houses. The sun was now barely peeking out from beneath the horizon, bathing the land in an orange glow that would have been breathtaking had she not seen it 1,000 times. There were the landmarks of her childhood, the Morphais cuisine joint that she and Dima frequented as children, a small playground near the old Hresvelg residence that now doubled as a dog park, and the marble statue to the god emperor that she once defiled with a marker. Cars and people shuffled about lazily in the evening commute, as the maglev train streaked past in a flash of silver. It was her home, but it also was a testament to the corruption and arrogance of New Fodlan. If she were to succeed, she certainly would have to tear it down metaphorically and literally if needed. Edelgard heard a beeping, denoting that the stray truck was back on her radar. Luckily, despite the lack of traffic, the transport truck was far slower than her. She caught up at a steady pace, watching the blue arrow inch closer and closer. The magistrate and her people soon vanished off of her display, and she redirected her attention to following the curves of the highway as she pushed the bike to its limits. She hoped that her team was handling things just fine, but the lack of communication told her that they had to be. If not, then she would have to start from square one. After all, the spark of rebellion was alive as long as she was. Now the truck came into view, still bumbling about on the road as if it was a normal day. Unfortunately for the driver and its contents, it was not. By the time she managed to catch up, she noticed two things. 1. The truck was heavily reinforced from the outside, which meant that her normal trick of cutting the tires wouldn't work. And 2. The truck had no armaments, odd for an escort vehicle. That certainly did not mean that it was unguarded, but it was quite enticing for Edelgard. Approaching the rear of the vehicle, she slowed her bike down so that it matched pace with the truck. She would have an opportunity to check out her hunch and whether or not this was all a waste of time. Edelgard was close enough that she could simply reach out and grab the door handles on the rear of the transport with some effort. But if she was hasty, she could end up losing her bike in the process. She instead tapped a few buttons on her bike to maintain a set distance from the truck autonomously. With a grunt of effort, she vaulted off of her hoverbike and reached for the handles. Her left foot embedded into the rear ledge, and both hands grabbed onto the handles. It was a miracle that the bars of metal didn't fall off from her impact, so she thanked her lucky stars and adjusted her footing. She then ripped the left door open with her bare hands, as the metal gave way to the darkness of its interior. Intruder! You're not Dash. The enforcer inside barely had time to protest before she leapt inside and kneed him in the helmet for his trouble. The glass on the outside cracked, leaving only a blood-stained visor as he fell to the floor. Now since that was out of the way, she could figure out what the magistrate had gone to so much trouble hiding. Edelgard glanced around. It was empty? No, she corrected herself. The trailer was mostly empty. The walls were completely plain, save for a couple questionable red stains, a few weapon racks, and some restraints mounted to each side. But the front. There was a greenish glow that illuminated the trailer, an alien color compared to the rays of sunlight streaming through the entrance she had made. She followed the glow to a horrifying, completely bizarre sight. What in the name of the goddess, she murmured. Her voice caught in her throat as she tried to finish the phrase, as unreligious as she was. In the name of the goddess, may she rest. And if she were alive, then she certainly had no presence here. It was some sort of tank, filled with a greenish liquid that she could not place. She assumed that it was some kind of containment chamber, as occasionally bubbles surfaced and disrupted the otherwise calm and smooth liquid. Edelgard stepped closer to take a better look, coming within arm's reach of the glass. To get a better look, she checked for cameras with a quick scan before closing her holox up into baton form and pressing her left hand to her face. The helmet lock disengaged, metal folding upwards as she disconnected the mask from the rest of her suit. She gently held onto it with her hand and shook the platinum hair out of her suit. It was all she could do to not stare in awe. The technology was unlike anything she had ever seen, and it wasn't steampunk old or even early silicon old. No, this was something else entirely. Pipes stuck out where they shouldn't, the material of the machinery was a dull hue as if it had been repeatedly cleaned over the years, and the way it was arranged seemed all wrong. It wasn't connected to a power source, and she noted a dense network of tubing on the side that must have served as a way to exchange fluids. She did not recognize the metal that made up the bulk of the system. But it was the actual chamber itself that drew her attention. The glass was a bit translucent, but she could see through enough to realize with horror that she was looking at a girl. The greenish fluid contained the body of a young girl, maybe no older than 14 to 15. She had light green hair with what might have once been curls, but now tangled everywhere as if she had been there for a very long time. It had quite the striking appearance and only served to puzzle Edelgard more. Her skin was immaculate, free of any blemishes save for a series of scars that crisscrossed her torso and chest. From her suspended body she seemed human at first glance, or at least she had all the human parts that mattered. She drifted in the liquid, her hair slowly moving in sync with the movement of her own breathing. But there was something else that bothered her, and she couldn't pinpoint why. Then she looked at the side of her head. Those were definitely not human ears. They were pointed, like the elves in the movies she used to watch with her mother. And that wasn't the only thing either. Some form of emerald green scales snaked up her left arm, almost as if she was in the midst of a transformation. To what, she did not know. This girl, if she could even be called that, was most definitely not human. An alien? Or maybe. There was an engraving in gold at the bottom of the chamber. She knelt down to dust it off, and she tried to decipher what it said. It was an ancient dialect, one that she had only seen in books. She tried sounding it out based on the phonetics she had studied briefly in university. Project. C-T-H, Leanne, she articulated. There was a different plaque under, one that was much more modern and thus written in modern Fodlani. Established in the year of our Lord Nemesis, she read out loud. In the year of our Lord Nemesis, was that when he won the Unification War? Or? Her head throbbed. Or they meant the year of the start of the calendar, when he slew Saint Cyros and her army in battle. And that would be over 1,000 years ago. Something was gnawing at the back of her mind. She felt so many things. Dread. Sickness. Pain. Pity. A sense of familiarity crept up her spine as she traced the engraving with her gloved fingers. She looked up at the girl's face, her eyes closed, her lips pressed together. Her face was contorted in pain. It might have been pretty, even beautiful once, but now she could barely manage to look at it without wanting to retch. It was like she knew this girl. And for some reason a phrase came to her mind. Flame, she said out loud. She had no idea what that meant. And then one of the eyes opened. Edelgard saw it. Saw thousands of worlds, thousands of possibilities spiral before her. It was as if the weight of the world had come collapsing down upon her, as her little mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. Flashes of gold, of silver, of azure, of crimson. Strange symbols etched themselves into her mind, alien arcs tracing out the outline of something she struggled to peel her eyes from. She felt the ebb of magic coursing through her veins, familiar yet unfamiliar at the same time. There was a pulse of power, and her thoughts repeated once more as she felt the presence of something utterly divine. Alien to her, but divine nonetheless. Edelgard von Hresvelg, the voice spoke in a discordant symphony. Who are you, really? She could not muster the strength to answer. And even if she could, she did not know anymore. She saw herself as a young little girl, forced to watch her siblings die one by one as she watched through the cold bars of a cell. There was a quiet sobbing as she gave in to her own despair, only for her to be dragged out by guards and into the waiting arms of a man in regal robes. It might have been reassuring, save for the glimmer of dark magic he held in the palm of his hand. She saw the girl, now a young woman, don a costume of a red armored knight. She carefully placed a ceramic mask over her grim face as her hands shook. A man in black stood next to her, adjusting the straps on the armor and placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Outside of the monastery walls, the moon shone a brilliant silver. She saw an emperor stand before her, golden crowns and horns curling on top of her platinum hair. She sat atop a golden throne emblazoned with the eagle crest of Hresvelg, fingers curling around her chin. And then there were the eyes. Her own purple eyes staring right back at her, cold, unfeeling, miserable. The eyes of someone who had the fate of the world in her hands. And she saw someone by her side with blue-green hair, wide eyes, and an empty expression on her face. A surge of emotions thawed the ice around her heart as she realized with startling finality that she was the one. There was one, and there would only ever be one. It was the most beautiful face she had ever seen. I see, intoned the voice once more. A different providence. A different time. A different life. How interesting. Edelgard floated in a sea of nothingness, her consciousness shattering and reforming. There was nothing but madness here. Her brain struggled and writhed under the feeling of 1,000 worlds pressed onto her, conflicting memories and thoughts surging through her head. A single sensation stuck out to her, the only thing anchoring her to the world of reality. There was a pulsing in what seemed to be her brain, steady, rhythmic, robotic. She zeroed in on that feeling as the voice continued. When next we meet, we shall do so as equals. Farewell, Edelgard. The last sight she saw was of a tall woman with flowing green hair and a golden crown. Elegant blue robes fell down from her shoulders, accented with golden crests. An eerie green glow came from her body. Her eyes remained closed, but unlike the girl in the tank, her expression was one of content and serenity. There was a comfort seeing her, as if she was oddly familiar, and yet so utterly detached from the world of reality. She caught a last glimpse as the woman floated in the vast expanse of the void, before her eyes opened and Edelgard found herself back in her own reality. What? She croaked, though it came out more as a grunt. The world took form around her and she found herself back inside the convoy truck, staring at the green glow before her. She felt something drip from her face onto the floor, and it was only then that she realized her nose was bleeding. But she could barely move. Her eyes were transfixed on the tank and its contents. Her mind went blank, like it had just been overloaded with something terrible. What in the world had happened? She remembered the eye-opening and then memories that were not hers. 1,000 things coursing through her mind, the power of a goddess overloading her brain. If she tried to recall it, she would only drive herself insane, if the pounding headache she had did not do her in first. It was all she could do to blink the moisture out of her eyes and make a feeble attempt to rise, though her head was throbbing and her mind was reeling. She felt each and every beat of her heart as blood pulsed through her body. And there was an eerie high-pitched whining that felt like it was coming from inside her skull, something that certainly did not belong there. It was almost like an out-of-body experience. But none of that mattered right now. With gritted teeth, Edelgard steeled herself for what she had to do. She would end it. She had to. There was something wrong with this place, and she would not let that girl suffer a single moment more. With a single click she whipped her hollowks out, letting the helmet clatter to the floor. The room now glowed with the clash of both green and red light, illuminating the poor girl floating in the tank. Please. Put her out of her misery. Those were not her thoughts. That was the voices. But as she raised her axe to put the poor girl to rest, Bernadetta's voice crackled over the comlink and brought her out of her trance-like state and back to reality. Boss. Boss. Edelgard scrambled to her feet, sheathing her axe for a moment. The eye was closed once again. Had she been dreaming? No, she had been trapped in dreams for far longer than that, and her body physically ached. It had been something else entirely. Can you read me? Her operator's voice buzzed with static from the fading signal, racked with panic. You have to go now. It must have been serious if she didn't have any of her trademark nervous tics. That got her attention, and so she quickly scooped up the mask off the floor and let it click into place on her face. She didn't want to think about what had just happened. The headache had stopped, but the high-pitched whine in her head only seemed to grow louder. On her visor, she saw red dots that marked patrol units flicker to life onto her screen, rapidly converging onto her position. The escort didn't know what was in the truck, she realized. Not until now. But now that the jig was up, she was made. If Edelgard was caught here, all her plans would be for nothing. And for the sake of her vengeance, she would have to live in order to see it through. Edelgard looked one last time at the poor girl floating inside her containment tank. The pained expression, the small movements of her breath, and the light green hair drifting aimlessly in the suspension liquid would be permanently etched in her mind for years to come. She had so many questions, so many memories that weren't hers, so much to think about. But only one thought was at the front of her mind. I'll come for you, she promised. I'll kill them all if I have to. She carefully climbed out of the back and leapt onto her bike, which was still thankfully trailing at a constant pace. A quick scan determined that there were no pursuers in her direct field of vision, but she doubted it would stay so for so long. Thank the goddess for her subordinates, a solo mission would have been suicide. With a small shove of her right arm the door swung shut, and she quickly swerved away from behind the truck and gunned the throttle. The bike lurched forward as it began to accelerate, and it was all she could do to not topple over as she squeezed so hard she could almost feel the metal handlebars start to bend. The truck started to accelerate as well, so she pushed the hoverbike to its limits as its engine roared with power. Her hand did not let up off the throttle until the truck and its accursed cargo were far past in the horizon, a little black speck among the supposed beauty of Newfoundland. Where's the nearest entrance to the abyss? She asked over comms. I am marked it for you. It's in Mina district. Just get back here safe, Edelgard. She bristled slightly at the use of her real name, but there was no time to protest. The sirens and engine noise faded out as her mind went into autopilot. Bright lights and scattered foliage poked out of her peripheral vision, and even through her armor she could feel the summer breeze from just how fast she was going. She barely noticed Bernadetta's frantic worrying over the comms as it faded into background noise. Her visor telling her where to drive and where to take evasive maneuvers barely registered on a conscious level, and even the patrol units she passed barely fazed her despite the various projectiles they threw at her. She was dimly aware that she was being chased by something, and she might have even slammed into a couple enforcers while making her hasty escape. But it was her body that was doing the work, her mind was somewhere else entirely. It was back in the truck, with the strange girl who had shattered her mind into a million pieces. Edelgard took 3 rapid right turns off of the route and into the alleys of Mina district, rushing by a street cafe so fast she barely had time to dodge pedestrians. Using an alleyway to double back, she managed to dodge her pursuers and take the Mina entrance into the abyss, a small hidden passageway between 2 shops. She did not stop to check for people in her way, or even if her pursuers were still on her tail. She simply went. Soon the sounds of the street gave way to nothing but the slow drip of water, as brick walls turned to concrete tunnels and into darkness. But even as Edelgard pulled up to the blast doors of her hideout and verified her identity with her irises, something within her still refused to work. It was almost as if she had seen a ghost, the ghost of a timeline that was no longer hers, and her brain could not reconcile any of it. There was something very, very wrong. But was it with her, or the world itself? All Edelgard von Hresvelg could hear was the sound of her blood pumping in her ears, as she struggled to wrap her head around the horrors that she had just seen. "My lord. What is it, Myson?" "It seems that Project Cethline has been intercepted by the one called the Queen of Flames. But the contents remain unaffected, as far as we can tell. And the guard? Dead. No signs of interrogation. Good. That saves us the trouble of executing him." "It seems," said the man, "that someone is prying into things too far above their station. The research into the Nabatean creatures must continue. Double the security, and make sure this never happens again." "Oh, and Myson?" "Yes, my lord. Kill the man responsible for the escort." "Of course. Is there anything else?" "Find the interceptor. It is not an urgent matter, and do it discreetly, of course. But find her nonetheless. That will be all." The man named Myson took his leave outside of the office. The other man paced around the room, thinking of the ramifications if Project Cethline was discovered. Certainly the God Emperor would be displeased. But if the truth about the past, about Agartha, about the Fell Star was discovered, well, he was not so certain his machinations would be enough to stop the consequences. But for now, he would simply have to wait. "Accursed Fell Star," he muttered. "Even after 1,000 years, you still find a way to interfere." But there was always a plan. And for Thales, former Agasthya of Shamhala, now right hand of the Empire, he would be prepared for anything. Never again would his people be caught off guard. And if the temporal readings were correct, then somebody was interfering with the timeline or had interfered. It could not be a coincidence with the raiding of Project Cethline. There was something significant afoot. The false goddess will finally be erased. And with this, Thales said, the world will finally become pure. Chapter 2, Noblesse Oblige. The Queen of Flames hoped that Caspar didn't notice just how distracted she was. Once Edelgard had returned sans anything of value, she hoped that her little band of mercenaries had at least got their money's worth. They came out a bit bloody and bruised, but on the upside no one died. She really didn't like when her men died, less because she cared and more because it was a waste of perfectly good resources. She was a queen, but of a kingdom that consisted of less than 24 mercenaries. There really weren't enough to spare. Caspar was giving her the mission report, with his usual embellishments. She wasn't really listening to him, she could just play back the recording later from her helmet. He got quite enthusiastic when it came to his reports, and as of the moment she wasn't in a mood to entertain him. She found it slightly amusing that they stole a crate of stim boosters and credits with relative ease, and the story of Monique tripping a guard so hard he fell face first onto his superior. But she would never admit that it was, in fact, amusing. Not to Caspar's face, at least. Caspar Berglis. The second son of the famous General Leopold von Berglis, and by all accounts the classic case of a second son with nothing to inherit and therefore nothing to lose. He was a bit on the short end, but he made up for it by sheer stubbornness and power of will. With his goofy disposition and short light blue hair, he stuck out like a sore thumb in Abyss and pretty much anywhere. It wasn't technically a bad thing, his reputation preceded him, and his power gauntlets were the talk of the town when they weren't babbling about her. They still hung by his side, hissing every once a while with released air as if they itched to crack some skulls. Edelgard always found it odd that Caspar was so willing to serve her. He wasn't doing this for the money after all. The formerly von Berglis family was quite well off after his father's service to the God Emperor. Instead, it was out of a childish sense of wanting to change the world for the better. The Empire had no room for the weak and infirm, and though Caspar was strong, he recognized that the current system was failing them. It was sheer chance that led the two of them to meet, after an eventful mission where Edelgard saved the Berglis matriarch from certain death, though she did not manage to save everyone that night. He then got on his knees and begged for her to take him under her service, perhaps the first of her followers, and her first lieutenant. His undying fidelity to her had not failed Edelgard since. "Are you listening, Queen?" he asked. He even tried to tap her visor, but she instinctively flinched backward when his fingers drew near. "Yes, Casper, I am," she replied begrudgingly. "Oh yeah? Then what did I just say?" He was quite lucky that her visor obscured her eyes, because she rolled her eyes at him, significantly more so than usual. "Casper, get to the point." "I was saying that it was definitely a decoy carrier, all right. Not to mention the sleazy guy inside just ran for his life. They didn't even try to protect him." His eyes narrowed, probably remembering Edelgard's pursuit of the actual target. "What did you find in the truck?" "Goddess." Edelgard put a hand on her forehead as if she was anticipating a headache. And her head did hurt just thinking about what she had seen. Project Cethlean. Flame. Nabatean blood. Strange glimpses of a different past. She was remembering things that made no sense. It was almost as if there was a dim whisper in the back of her mind, threatening to subsume her consciousness if she stopped focusing. And the voice that she had heard, what did their words mean? "I saw a girl suspended in some sort of tank," she admitted. "Some sort of experiment." She neglected to mention the strange name inscribed, or the archaic technology that made up her confinement chamber, or the fact that her eye opened when she should have been dead. "What?" he shouted. She winced. The headache was already starting to gnaw at her brain, building up pressure in ways that made her nauseous. "No need to be loud, Casper. Is the Empire doing more of their experiments?" he snarled. Why was she so damn valuable that she needed an escort in a whole decoy ruse? Was that why we raided that convoy? Is she? He paused, probably at Edelgard's lack of response. "Did you free her? Or did you?" Edelgard sighed. "No. Something told me that if I did anything it would have killed her." "And how can you know that for sure?" She shrugged. "Intuition. And you're just gonna let them experiment on her?" "Not our priority right now." Now it was Casper's turn to shake his head. "And you're telling me, you didn't find anything else of value?" "Casper, if you keep asking about it, I will personally assign you to janitorial duties for the next year. But before he had a chance to mouth off in response, his subordinate ran up behind him and started giving him an earful. Flesh Burgleys, his lieutenant and nephew, was a brown-haired girl with bright blue eyes who looked right out of a Newfoundland high school. But the vibrodaggers hanging on her side said otherwise, not to mention the lithe black and beige armor that she was covered in. Many a man had underestimated her, only to have their throats slit in an instant. She supposed that it was a bit odd to see Casper's nephew manhandle him so, but she let her drag Casper off by the ear. Thank the goddess for flesh, she thought absent-mindedly. She was going to have an aneurysm if he kept talking to him. She watched as the two headed off, before clutching her head to try to stifle the oncoming headache. She might have to see Mercedes if that continued. Regardless, Edelgard had business to attend to. She needed to pay Bernadetta a visit anyway, and so she spun around on the heel of her combat boots and walked off. The Queen of Flames' hideout wasn't exactly hidden. It was too obvious if she set up in Abyss, so she operated out of one of the old subway stations slightly above the tunnels that made up the underground of Newfoundland. Margrave Station was small enough to be unnoticeable, but large enough to host a great deal of people. It was also completely tech-proofed, so prying eyes would find nothing but an empty cavern. She had spent the better half of a year fixing it up with the help of Linhard and Bernadetta until it was a suitable base. And it was quite expensive. Though she had enough wealth from the Hresvelg and Bladdid reserves not to worry, it still was a sizable amount of credits that she had burned. Barely a trace of the old subway station remained, save for the tracks and a small engraving on the tunnel wall that said, Margrave Station. One side of the subway station was blocked off completely with a solid wall of concrete and metal, and for good measure she had collapsed the rest of the tunnel. The other side served as the entrance and exit to her base, guarded by a massive blast door. Now they were merely left with a large room that constituted her command center and several smaller maintenance tunnels that led to a couple dozen side rooms. The main room itself was quite expansive, with massive floodlights illuminating the entire hideout embedded on the reinforced rock ceiling. A couple steel walkways crisscrossed the cavern above her, and with the help of some heavy machinery she had torn up the old rails and installed proper tiled floors. It was nothing compared to the old Hresvelg Manor or even Bladdid Tower, but it was her home away from home. The command center was at the end of the sealed-off tunnel, projected hollow screens taking up every inch of the wall and covering everything from news broadcasts to the stock market. It was a dizzying amount of information, as she watched lines of code trickle downward side by side with a very familiar holodrama featuring an emperor and her knight. At the center of all of them was a set of very expensive leather operating chairs, though only one was being occupied. She saw the muted purple hair of a very familiar girl, who barely even noticed Edelgard's approach as she walked down the mezzanine's stairs and toward her. Her fingers were moving incredibly quickly on her operator board as she moved from search query to search query, sifting through information at light speed while still keeping her eyes glued to the scene unfolding before her. Coming up from the chair, she tapped Bernadetta on the shoulder of her oversized t-shirt. "Eek," she gasped in surprise, whirling her chair around. "Pleased and Kilbernio." Bernadetta finally looked up to see the helmet of her commander, staring back down at her with confusion. Hey, Edelgard," she whispered. Nobody else was in earshot, so it was okay to use her real name. Only a few people knew her true identity, considering that she was still in full armor and hadn't planned on taking off her helmet anytime soon in the base. Bernadetta was one of them. There was no hiding secrets from her operator's prying eyes. But even fewer knew what her real name really meant, the secrets of family and tragedy that she hid deep within her heart. And so, for the sake of operational security, she used her name quite sparingly. "Hi," she replied curtly. "I appreciate the friendliness, Bernadetta, but you're supposed to call me Queen here." Okay. "Queen," Bernadetta said hesitantly. "What, do you want to talk about?" "I want every piece of information you have on something called Project Cethline." "Cethline?" She frowned. I don't remember reading anything about a Cethline." It was rare that Bernie had no clue about something. The poor girl spent so much time on the web that few pieces of information were left unturned in her wake. Edelgard suspected that had it not been for her intervention, she would still be cooped up in her room avoiding her parents and playing RPGs until she grew old and decrepit. She was just glad that the girl was willing to help her cause, just like Casper. She wanted to do good. She still wasn't really sure what she meant by that, but regardless, Edelgard appreciated both her help and her company. Bernadetta von Varley. She studied the girl's nervous expression and couldn't help but smile at her innocence. In the world of trained killers and private military companies, she was an oddball. Dressed in her usual outfit of oversized t-shirt and pajama pants, in combination with her hair it looked as if she had just rolled out of bed. But she was the hardest worker out of all of Edelgard's subordinates, and the backbone of her entire operation. Bernadetta was not much younger than Edelgard herself. She had finished high school only a few years ago. Perhaps it was fate that she reconnected with Bernadetta after her family's tragedy. After all, the Varleys were one of Newfoundland's preeminent noble families. She had known her for quite a long time through various functions and events. What did noble mean anyway? She supposed that it was just a saying, and that nobility certainly did not mean one was noble. After all, each major noble family was supposedly descended distantly from the god emperor Nemesis himself. They said that the scion of each house was sired by Nemesis, and his power coursed through the veins of his descendants. And while they were not given official titles and deeds like in the days of Adrestia, they styled themselves as something greater than the common masses. Most noble houses were very wealthy, and curried great political power and favor. The major ones, including her own, had been bulwarks of the god emperor, meant to support his armies with their own forces and colonize worlds in his name. They had been around for almost a millennia, and until very recently were thought to be untouchable. The minor ones were more recent, less bound by tradition, and more by power and wealth. They had ostensibly grown rich during the Unification War when the god emperor united the nation of Fodlan into his empire. And they would do anything to keep their power, which often meant oppressing those below them so that they could never dream of rising up. Disgusting. Nothing more than slaves to power. If Edelgard had it her way, she would tear the entire system down and rebuild it anew. The rich and powerful were nothing but blights on humanity, who cared for nothing other than maintaining their power and wealth. That was part of why she had become the Queen of Flames. She was just an infamous mercenary at the moment, but given the right opportunity she hoped to be something more. She wanted to rebel against the God Emperor and all who stood by his side. Maybe in due time, she could convince herself that she was doing it to create a better world and not just for her own personal vengeance. Her thoughts drifted to the first time she had met Bernie, the name her operator called herself when she thought people weren't listening. After the marriage of Anselma and Lambert, Edelgard had been torn between two families and their social obligations from the age of 8. One of them was keeping up appearances as the scion of the disgraced House Hresvelg, even if she was technically obladed by her mother's marriage. She detested the sycophants who approached her at parties and asked for favors, along with the other noble children who seemed to have their heads too far up their own rears to see the forest from the trees. Only the occasional presence of her mischievous little step-brother made things bearable, and even then Edelgard usually returned home with a scowl on her face. This time, she had shaken off the other kids and managed to distract the von Agier boy by goading him into spilling soda on the Novelli girl. The ball that they were attending had been grand, and no expense had been spared for the noble families who attended. Only her mother was there. Lambert Egypt Bladded would have stirred up far too much of a fuss if he attended. But she mostly was busy making backroom deals for the sake of the Arundel and Bladded families with unscrupulous men and women, and so the two children were left to their own devices. Dmitri Alexander Bladded was being a nuisance again. The kid was barely 9, and for only being 3 years older it was already becoming unbearable to keep up with his energy. He practically teleported from place to place, bouncing off the walls with his infectious energy. His slightly too long straw blonde hair stuck out like a sore pig, and so it was easy to keep eyes on him. But every time he did something wrong, all he did was pout with his bright blue eyes, and Edelgard's heart practically melted. She was his older sister, for better and for worse. And though he definitely deserved more than his fair share of punishments, she loved him with all his heart. And if anything happened to him, she would enact her vengeance on the world. A statement that would come back to haunt her later. For now, though, it seemed that Dimitri's attention was fixated on a girl with purple hair sitting in the corner and trying to hide from the rest of the party. She looked about a year younger than Edelgard, and it was good that he was making an effort to meet people and make friends. Edelgard just had to hope that he was too young to think about girls. She really didn't want to think about her little brother learning how to flirt from her stepfather. Should we bother her? Grinned Dmitri mischievously. He was dressed in a small black suit that was a bit dirty from the food he had eaten previously. A bit of corn was stuck in his long locks of hair, which she plucked out quickly before he could notice. No, she scolded. Then she thought about it for a bit. It couldn't be worse than talking to those noble brats, right? Fine, she conceded. How bad can it be? Let's go talk to her. Placing down the can of soda she was eagerly sipping on, she skipped on over with her little brother in tow towards the mysterious girl. Edelgard approached her from the front, and it took a few seconds for the girl to look up from her holodeck and see Edelgard's outstretched hand. Hi. I'm Edelgard. She chirped. What's your name? The girl met her gaze, and suddenly developed an appetite for her own fingernails. Her eyes widened at the new person in front of her. She was a bit confused at the fact that a noble was so shy, but then she remembered that she infinitely preferred it to the spoiled rich kids that were running around the dinner table as of the moment. Edelgard decided to simply smile reassuringly at the girl and make her feel comfortable. It's okay, she said. I know it's hard meeting new people. Especially, as she gestured to the lively formal behind her, when you're overwhelmed. Why yeah. Bernie shouldn't be so scared, but, she whispered. Oh. I'm, Be Bernadetta. Bernadetta von Varley. Edelgard's hand still remained awkwardly outstretched, so she sheepishly pulled it back. Oh, said a voice behind Edelgard. It's the Varley girl. The Varleys were known for their judiciary work and their support of the Church of the Goddess, a powerful noble family that still remained in control of far too much of the legal system. It was too bad that they were saddled by rumors of their shy child, or was it rumors that they were awful parents? She didn't really remember too well. Eek! Bernadetta shrieked. She was probably not used to talking to boys, and Dmitri could be a little intimidating. It was the glare, probably. Or it was the suit. It's okay, Edelgard said, and she placed a hand on her shoulder reassuringly. The girl Bernadetta flinched at first, but then she gradually relaxed as she realized the older girl wasn't trying to kill her. "This is my little brother," she explained. She motioned theatrically toward the boy fidgeting behind her. "Dimma doesn't bite. Right, Dimma?" He made a chomping motion with his jaws. "No promises." She turned around and glared at him. "Be nice." He ignored her. "Hi, I'm Dmitri," he said cheerfully. "It's very nice to meet you." Hi, she managed to squeak out. Dmitri reached into his suit pocket to pull out a deck of cards, and Edelgard winced. Those seemed very expensive and she wondered which noble he had lifted it from this time. Hopefully it wouldn't result in his gaming console being taken away like last time. "Wanna play Go Fish?" he asked. Edelgard had no idea just how useful that random meeting would be until many years later. She didn't see Bernadetta again until she was 20. Tales were told of the mysterious netrunner who could hack into anything connected to the web. Going by the call sign Care Bear, the Queen of Flames was quite familiar with the handiwork of an excellent operator. More than a few magistrate servers had been hacked and leaked onto the net, and it was fairly obvious who was responsible. It had taken a few close brushes with the magistrate and their Netwatch division, but finally she managed to set up a meeting face-to-face. It was to be in exchange for the physical decryption software that she had lifted off an agent after his untimely demise at her hands. But when she had actually arranged a meeting at one of her safe houses, she almost laughed. Not at Bernadetta, the poor thing would probably faint if she did, but at fate itself. She hadn't seen her in years. Not since the tragedy of Dusker and her family being wiped off the face of Newfoundland. And it was fate that had brought the two of them together once more. It didn't take long for Edelgard's helmet to come off and for Bernie to gush about how cool the Queen of Flames was. The two reconnected quite easily, and so that was how Bernadetta von Varley found herself moonlighting as Edelgard's operator. Part of it was her own desire to help people despite her timidness, but it was also the fact that she simply wanted to know. The curse of knowledge was often a fatal one, and now she could search all she wanted under the protection of the Queen of Flames. More than one incident had already landed her in hot water, though that was more because of her parents than the magistrate. The stories that Bernadetta told made her shiver, and oftentimes Edelgard considered hunting her father down and killing him with her own two hands. They cared nothing for her except to pawn her off to some rich mogul as a demure housewife, and her work supposedly made her unmarriageable. But now that she had chosen her own path in life, there wasn't much that her parents could do other than wish her the best and send her a few weekly checks. Such was the life of a noble girl. Edelgard almost pitied them despite having been one herself. Now she lived in Edelgard's hideout, spending her days searching the web and occasionally even talking to some of her mercenaries face to face. At first she feared that they would be rude or even uncouth toward the girl, but all of them were incredibly nice. Perhaps they also sensed that Bernadetta was a precious cinnamon roll who deserved every bit of protection in the world. But that did not mean she was useless. In fact, far from it. Many an operation had been salvaged by Bernie's untimely intervention and her uncanny ability to find gaps in the magistrate's defenses. In between watching holodramas and writing fanfictions, she did terrifyingly efficient work, whether it was combing the internet for a proverbial needle in a haystack or hacking into secured magistrate servers. Bernie was absolutely terrified of most things, but put her in front of a keyboard and nothing fazed her. She couldn't ask for a better operator. Or maybe even a better friend. She knew far more than Edelgard ever would. So to see Bernie confused about something was troubling, to say the least. "I've never heard of this, what was it again?" Cethline. The word sounded strange on her tongue, but somehow she was absolutely sure that it was how it was pronounced. And so the mystery continued. The word was familiar, and yet she had somehow never heard it before. What in the flames of Alel did this all mean? Something in her desperately yearned to know, something screamed at her to do something, to save poor Flame from the death night end. What? She blinked twice to make sure she was still partially sane. Cethleann, Bernadetta's voice brought her back to reality. Yeah, that. Her expression furrowed into a frown. I can try combing the web through the filter, but it's going to take a while too. I have a few contacts I can ask about it as well, maybe they know more than I do. Contacts. Bernie didn't talk to anybody. I mean I send them messages. I've never actually seen their faces, you know. Oh. Edelgard replied, a bit disappointed. Online friends simply didn't have the same benefits as face-to-face friends, though she supposed that was probably because Edelgard didn't have any of the former. That's okay. I can find more people to ask. Bernie won't disappoint you. You never have. Thank you, Bernie, she said. You're just so helpful, you know. She flashed a small smile at her operator. She perked up at that statement. Really? You really mean it? Edelgard removed her gauntlet and ruffled Bernadetta's messy purple hair for good measure. Of course. Always. Edelgard plopped down on her king-size bed. It was large, and had enough space for her to toss and turn when she had her nightmares. Money could buy comfort, at least. But it was awfully lonely, and she felt like she was missing a person-sized hole in her heart. She was back in her own house. It was a little after 3 in the morning, and after a long day of combat and searching she was positively exhausted. She was in almost nothing but her nightwear, and with a flick of her wrist she dimmed the lights. Sleep, she thought numbly. Sleep would be great. Her house was a little villa in the district of Inver, a small glass and wood house surrounded by a couple of planter boxes. It was still a pretty expensive undertaking to own her own house, and sometimes she was thankful she still had access to the ancestral Hresvelg fortune. If it meant not having to steal and cheat to make rent each month, she was happy to use any advantage she had. But there was a small twinge of guilt in her heart. That money dripped with blood, both of her family's and of the people her family had stepped over to make their fortune. But at least, she thought bitterly, I'm the last of the Hresvelgs. I will be the last Hresvelg. And it will all be for a noble cause. Was that a joke she just made? I must be feverish, she thought to herself. She giggled, knowing that no one could hear her in her solitude. Edelgard von Hresvelg lived a relatively Spartan existence, as her room was mostly blank other than the bed, her dresser, a small mahogany work table, and a mood light set up above her. On her table lay half-finished designs, unhatched schemes and plots that would probably have her executed if any enforcer rifled through her apartment. Luckily I have a contingency for that, so they can stay on the desk where I can see them. On her dresser lay her axe, folded up. She was never one to sleep without a weapon at arm's length, and a couple of undergarments scattered haphazardly. Her room alone was more incriminating than the most gruesome murder scene, but she could not worry about being caught at the moment. Though the thought always remained in the back of her head, the fear that her double life would come crashing down at any moment. Edelgard would rather plan for the worst than fear it all her life. Through the window she could see the waxing moon, illuminating her bed with only the faintest of light. Was it the blue sea moon or verdant rain moon? Perhaps they'd be celebrating the rite of rebirth sooner than later? Edelgard had barely been lying down for 5 minutes before she shot up, an odd feeling pulsing in her head. The rite of rebirth? Ever since that damned girl in the tube she had been having strange thoughts. Bits and pieces of memories that were not hers, phrases and feelings that sprung to mind whenever she looked at an object or talked to a person. It was like the feeling of déjà vu, except even if she tried hard enough she could not place where or what she had obtained this information from. What was being reborn? And a rite sounded so pagan. These were rituals from the past, or perhaps a different world entirely, things that didn't make sense if she thought about them too hard but instead simply felt natural. Goddess damn it! She wiped her brow free of sweat and laid back down. She would have to get to the bottom of this. But she was exhausted, and so she had to sleep or else. Edelgard knew that if she didn't sleep, it would jeopardize her plans once they found out the Queen was running off 3 cups of coffee and 2 hours of sleep. But sleep didn't come very easily for poor Edelgard von Hresvelg, and it often came at the price of her sanity. She could only guess what awaited in her dreams, and she steeled herself for the inevitable. She clutched her blankets tightly and tried not to think about what was wrong with her. She prayed to absolutely no one in particular that it would all work out in the end. Would it? Edelgard waited and squeezed her eyelids tighter, willing herself to go to sleep until finally darkness took hold of her. Chapter 3, The Tailtean Plains. Her dreams had been odd as of lately. More accurately, Edelgard assumed they were odd because she could not remember a single one of her dreams. Dima used to tease her about the little dream journal she kept as a child, but now even when she laid out a pen and paper by her bedside in the morning she could not bring herself to remember what she had dreamed. All Edelgard knew was that they weren't exactly pleasant. The sweat on her brow and sudden awakening usually suggested that something had gone very, very wrong. But that was all. They were nightmares of her past, she presumed. They could not harm her anymore. She hoped that she would have pleasant dreams tonight. But unfortunately for Edelgard, she was very, very wrong. The first thing she felt was the rain. It wasn't the slow drip of a light drizzle. No. This was a torrential downpour, as she felt water slough off her thick armor and pour onto the ground, pooling beneath her and leaving the ground soft. Her boots were covered in mud, and she struggled to keep herself from being swallowed by the earth. The sky was dim, the sun refusing to peek out from the dark clouds that hovered over her head almost as if it didn't want to bear witness to the flames below. She found herself in the midst of a battle. It wasn't the sound of steel clashing against steel or the din of the dying, or even the smoke billowing across the battlefield that told her that. It was the smell. The unmistakable stench of death. Once upon a time, when she still had the innocence of childhood, she would have retched and hid under her bed for the rest of the day. But now she barely even reacted. She had seen far too much death in her life to shy away from it. Once upon a time, as a child, she would have hid behind her stepfather or her mother as they shielded her eyes, but she no longer had the luxury of doing so. Edelgard couldn't see most of herself, but she felt the heavy embrace of antique armor, red and gold and embroidered with designs that felt oddly familiar, but she could not recall with certainty. An eagle. The seal of Hresvelg? She wondered. It was much, much heavier than her armor as the Queen of Flames, and she felt herself strain with each step. But though she felt slow and sluggish, she also felt unstoppable. A wall of pure iron, marching toward her goal whatever it was in the dream. Her metal gauntlets wrapped around an axe, nearly as long as she was tall. The blade wasn't anything she recognized, except that it was made of bone. That was why it looked odd. Spikes protruded out of its back edge, and the front was one giant, curved, and razor-sharp bone. But it wasn't as white as bone usually was, and Edelgard had seen quite enough bones for the rest of her life. It was the color of old parchment. This made the axe oddly light for its size, but in spite of this, she drew a small bit of comfort from how perfectly balanced and natural it felt in her hands. But the rhythmic pulsing and the occasional shuddering of the weapon, almost as if it was alive, was enough to make her want to retch. Aimer was made for me. She frowned. Or at least, she realized that she couldn't actually frown, because she was merely a spectator inside of her own body. And it was hers, unmistakably so, but it was a very different Edelgard, one that relied more on brute strength than she did. And this one was busy fighting for her life, tearing through soldiers as they tried to skewer them from all angles that much at least felt familiar. But if it was a very different Edelgard, then why did she know the name of the axe she held? In her peripheral vision she could see snippets of action. Something flew down to swipe at a squadron of soldiers. She struggled to understand what it was until she realized it was a wyvern. They were the ones in the stories that her mother used to read to her, who would take bad children and eat them up if they didn't promise to behave. But seeing them in all their glory was different. Their scales alternated between dull and iridescent, slick with blood and mud in equal parts. The rider had a flowing mane of orange hair, wielding a strange-looking spear and stabbing at anything in his way. Soldiers scattered and fled at his presence, and despite a veritable rain of arrows headed his way, he refused to retreat and charged headlong. Off to her left, a girl with faded blue hair fired rays of light at oncoming soldiers, while another girl next to her fiercely hacked away at anything that came near. Her pink hair was covered in gore, and the massive axe that she wielded hit the ground hard enough to create a small fissure in the earth. They stood back to back, fighting off men in steel and red who tried to storm their position. Magic, she thought. She was never a believer in most things supernatural, and growing up she always laughed at her little brother for being so gullible. But here it was, light shooting out of the blue-haired girl's fingertips, green sparks dancing around the open wound on her side until it faded to nothing more than a crimson stain on her mud-stained robes. She reminded herself that she was in a dream, and magic was still technically impossible. But was it a dream, or a memory? It sure felt like the latter. Her right was nothing but chaos as battalion met battalion in close combat, and she wondered whose side was she on. Was she losing or winning? The ground was covered in blood and bodies, and she could hardly step anywhere without stepping on a broken weapon or a broken soul. It seemed as if the storm had only gotten worse, and she was no longer sure if the wetness she felt on her clothing was rain or blood. The Tailtean Plains. Just thinking of that name filled her with dread for some reason. Edelgard was so focused on taking in the whole scene that she barely realized that she was fighting someone. As she used the haft of her axe to deflect an oncoming lance strike, she took the time to take in the details of her opponent. Black armor with blue in the middle, he was draped in some sort of fur which wrapped around his shoulder pauldrons and his gigantic blue cape. He really liked blue. He carried a lance. Between frenzied strikes Edelgard saw that it was much like her own relic weapon. Eredbar. Crest of Bladdid. Something stirred within her. But she did not know what it meant. And his face, messy blonde hair covered most of his features, but she could see his bright blue eyes and strong jawline. She might have even called him handsome, if not for the expression of pure rage etched across his face. Who was this? And why did she feel so connected to who this man was? Blonde. Blue eyes. She tried to scream, but her body simply kept on fighting, kept on slashing. Gentle features hidden by anger. Edelgard tried to push the thought to the back of her head, that there was no way he could be here, that he was dead. But she could not change the fact that he was here in front of her. This could only be her little brother. Dima. All grown up. She wanted to cry, wanted to reach out and hug him, and tell him that everything was going to be all right. She tried not to think of the last time she saw him. But now here he was, taller than she had ever been, fighting with the skill and ferocity of a dozen men. And now we're trying to kill each other. A storm of emotions swirled through Edelgard's mind. What is this? She wondered. A curse? Putting my dead brother's face on a man I would never meet, in a world that I would never step foot in? Perhaps this was the goddess's doing, dead as she was. A cruel trick from beyond the grave. Oh, Dima. Edelgard's body pressed the attack, as she slashed in a wide arc to push Dmitri away. Dmitri easily dodged it and used the range advantage of his lance to pressure her, but she knew better than to get outspaced by her own little brother. She quickly ducked under a wild stab of Eredbar and brought Aimr in a low sweep, which was barely dodged by a quick step back. He replied with a giant twirl of his lance, which would have taken her head off if not for some quick thinking on her part, as she used the blade of her axe to barely deflect his attack. Sparks flew from where the two blades collided, singing her face and knocking her back from the shockwave. "Must you continue to conquer?" he shouted. His voice was deeper than expected, almost a low growl. "You, who have trampled this continent twice over with your accursed war. Like you're one to talk," she coolly replied. "You refuse the peace I would bring to this world shackled by the chains of the church and belief." It was not feeling her lips move wholly of their own volition. This was punctuated by another stab of Eredbar and another heavy swing of Aimr, cracking the ground where it had struck. "You believe in nothing but yourself," he snarled. "You must be erased from this world entirely. I will not stop. There is nothing I would not sacrifice to cut a path to Fodlan's new dawn," she declared, her voice ringing across the battlefield and the din of the dying. And with that, Edelgard von Hresvelg swung Aimr at her younger brother so hard that both her crests activated, as power surged through her veins and into her strike. Crests? She brought the full weight of her body into her attack, betting it all on a single blow. Dmitri blocked with Eredbar, but it was too little too late. She could only watch in horror as this other Edelgard hit him so hard he flew backward, far, far, too far, until he came to a stop on the ground. He wasn't dead, of course. Edelgard knew that Dima was too much of a stubborn bastard to die that easily. Not here, not in her memories, not in any world. And so he got up, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, but still ready to fight another day. "Enough of this madness. This future of yours is built on a foundation of corpses and tears," he screamed. "And today it ends." He raised his lance once more in defiance, but it was clear that he was in pain. In combat, these were the deciding moments between victory and death. And now that Dmitri was on the back foot, he was only delaying the inevitable. Her axe aimer, felt like a block of lead in her hands as she struggled in vain to put it down, do anything but raise it. Edelgard felt a single tear roll down her cheek, but her counterpart's expression remained stoic otherwise. No. No. She's going to kill Dima. But it was still her. Even if it was another world, another timeline, another memory, she felt her hands grip her axe all the same. I'm going to kill Dimitri with my own two hands, she thought bitterly. And there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. The two weapons met once more with a deafening crash, as crest clashed against crest. Then Edelgard's eyes finally opened, and it was only then that she tasted the bile in her mouth and felt something wet fall onto her cheek. Chapter 4, Her Mask. Edelgard barely had time to put on half of a decent outfit before her butler started calling. Good morning, Miss Edelgard, it chirped. Do you need anything to start the day? I'm fine, thank you, she muttered hastily, as she quickly buttoned on her dress. Her fingers fumbled, and she ended up absent-mindedly tracing the patchwork of scars around her chest. That one, she mused morbidly, was from that demmed enforcer with the fancy footwork. It would take months for that one to fully heal. And this one, as she poked at a sore spot under her arm, was from the dagger she took for Petra. Her fingers moved right below her right breast, where a small but noticeable white line was there. But this scar will never heal. And as she touched it she shivered a little, recalling the sensation of the scalpel touching her skin. It was a permanent reminder of the augmentations she had gone through. Suffered through. She could of course get Cosmo surgery and heal her skin, but she didn't really care much for it. Ignoring the fact that she hated surgery with all of her heart, she simply did not care enough about what people thought was under her chest. The only consequence was that she couldn't wear anything with a plunging neckline, and that was something best left to Dorothea. You have an appointment in 12 minutes with Miss Arnold, it reminded her. Edelgard's robo-butler was in the kitchen, awaiting orders to cook something, dim the lights, or do whatever butlers were supposed to do. It was one of the newer models from Robotiques, and she knew that everyone wanted the latest model. Keeping up her appearance as a socialite was silly sometimes, and sometimes she wanted to resist the urge to throw it into Alel. Still, its white visage and cheerful blue emoticon displayed on its face screen was somewhat adorable, and she begrudgingly enjoyed just how enthusiastic it could be sometimes. She missed Hubert sometimes, but she also didn't mind his robotic replacement now that she wasn't exactly recognized nobility anymore. Hubert was good company back when he was still around, even as dark and brooding as he was. He always knew what to say when she was upset, but the unspoken truth was sometimes she wanted to be left alone. And at any rate, her current butler couldn't really compare considering it was never really alive in the first place. It couldn't be, not after the Pharaoh Accords centuries ago, and the strong AI purges and ensuing decrees. It was just a series of ones and zeros, meant to do as it was told and never question its orders. And she supposed that since it wasn't alive, she was technically alone. And that was the way that Edelgard Eisner liked it. Every day, for the last 8 years, aside from certain incidents. Mere lapses of judgment. 12 minutes, she muttered to herself, as she did her makeup and gathered her accessories. She was never really one to fret too much about her appearance, so just the right application of mascara and a little bit of lip gloss would do. It wouldn't do to look like one of those accursed net models, caked in makeup and Cosmo surgery, so Edelgard decided to keep it simple as always. She sprayed herself with perfume Dorothea had given her. It smelled of red flowers and summer fields, which was good enough for her. And of course, she needed some concealer to hide the bags under her eyes. She had not been getting a lot of sleep as of late, and last night definitely didn't help. Her bathroom was a bit of a mess. Makeup, skincare products, and toothpaste were scattered all around her sink. If her mother were still around, she would probably scold her for being so disorganized. For a second she thought about cleaning up, but then her own reflection in the full-body mirror behind the door caught her eye. Who was this standing before her, this unrecognizable woman? At least she still had the same lilac eyes that her mother had, and the high cheekbones typical of a Hresvelg. But Edelgard did not recognize her own face, or the strange expression that looked back at her. It's the hair, she thought. Damned white hair. It wasn't the same streaks of silver that her father had before She gulped. It was more of a platinum color. Otherworldly. Unnatural. Sometimes she considered dyeing her hair maybe fiery red, or some strange shade of green like the girl had, or maybe even back to her original brown. Once upon a time Edelgard might have been jealous of her brother's straw-colored hair or Bernadetta's strangely purple color when she only had brown hair. But now she would have done anything to have her hair back, to be the old Elle, and dyeing her hair was superficial at best. So out of defiance, the white hair stayed, and hopefully it was a good enough disguise to stave off any curious parties. Her hair was neatly tied with a small purple ribbon so that it wouldn't go everywhere, and 2 front strands were draped across her shoulders. And since her hair was so striking, her outfit had to be a little subdued to complement it. A black blazer with some white peeking out over a simple red dress and tights would do. Nothing too garish or uptight. She was, after all, going out to lunch with a friend. And friends were necessary for Edelgard Eisner to keep up appearances. She had chosen the last name Eisner to hide that she was the last scion of House Hresvelg, and to hide that she was very dead on the public record. Mouse, a little brown-haired Edelgard von Hresvelg was dead. Edelgard Eisner, with her striking dyed platinum hair, had killed her. She had supposedly chosen the last name Eisner on a whim, but she had the strangest feeling of déjà vu every time she said it. She would probably have to look into it later whether she liked it or not. Names held power. Under her dress she hid her trusty axe, name yet to be determined. But the craftsmanship was too good, and the materials were too expensive to not christen it something. It lay folded in on itself, as most concealable weapons did, until it looked like nothing more than a simple fashion statement. She struggled for a few minutes to fit it properly before swearing and instead hiding a small knife the length of her hand underneath. As she stepped out of her bathroom and into her relatively quaint living room, she caught a glimpse at the pen and paper she had written on earlier this morning. The argument still raged on whether or not simple handwriting had any use when screens and still uses did the exact thing, but for some reason she took comfort in antiquity. And emotions, she thought, flowed better on real paper. In another world she would have been a writer, but she simply did not have the luxury of a peaceful life. There was a lot scribbled in hasty handwriting. Aimer. Dimma. Crest of Bladdid. Tailtian. Marianne and Leonie. Ferdinand. None of it really made sense. This was the first dream she recalled having in months, and she was not about to forget any of it. But what did it all mean? This had to have been connected to the supply convoy raid yesterday. Did seeing that girl awaken memories that shouldn't have been there? Miss Edelgard. She turned, thoroughly taken aback by the interruption. You'd best get going if you don't want to be late. Her robo-butler flashed a pixelated smile at her. Stupid heap of scrap, interrupting her train of thought. But for now, she'd have to figure this out later. Dorothea wasn't gonna wait forever. She paused in the middle of the Hresvelg Bridge. The bridge was built only a few decades ago, from the original schematics of New Fodlan. With maglev, car, and pedestrian lanes, it was one of the busiest pathways in the city. The bridge itself wasn't too remarkable, red with golden accents, the traditional color of the Hresvelgs. The synthetic steel blend meant that no cables and no trusses were necessary, sound and vibration mufflers meant that traffic was barely noticeable, and the walkways were grand and open. It was a bridge first and foremost designed for pedestrians, and what utopia didn't have a place to take filtered photos of the city for propaganda purposes. But as she looked across the Fodlan River, the tributary that split the megacity in half, Edelgard von Hresvelg was reminded of it all. The bridge was the last relic of the Hresvelgs, a dead family that had been wiped off the face of the known universe. She was surprised when they didn't rename it after she and all of her kin were declared dead. Maybe it's there to taunt me. A reminder of what I've lost. Her view was breathtaking, or at least as breathtaking as it could be to someone who passed by every day. Beautiful skyscrapers rose above the rest of the city in the downtown district, and she swore that each one rose higher and higher each time they built one. Sooner or later they'd simply be sky elevators, massive monuments to the hubris of man. To her left, she looked at where she had come from, the residential district of Inver, with its gleaming glass buildings and homes arranged in neat rows and columns. On her right, she saw the sprawling park characteristic of the Melis district, the largest park within a 50-click radius and where she spent much of her time ruminating. She tried peering beyond that, beyond the Faergus zone, beyond the Itha district, where she might catch a glimpse of the outskirts of Newfoundland. But without her drone she had no eyes, and so she simply kept searching for something that might catch her eye. The outskirts weren't technically slums, the houses were almost as expensive, the streets almost as clean. But the key word was almost. Rarely did the residents of the city step outside the borders of safety, unless they had business on the wrong side of the law. And the wrong side of the law was where the Queen of Flames did her best work. It was called Newfoundland because the old city was quite literally buried underneath. Her hideout was one of the old subway stations from antiquity that they didn't bother to collapse, and many a relic could be found if you looked hard enough. Though it was quite a large city, it lacked the sheer density that was found before the Unification War, where skyscrapers could pack thousands of people into a small space. She shuddered at that thought. Who would want to live like rats, pressed up against one another until they suffocated? The upside was that the residents of Newfoundland had much more space than they would have had in the old city, but the unspoken downside was that there were simply a lot less people in the world. The megacity was split up into districts, although the line between districts was not easily demarcated. While most were residential, each district tended to have their own specialty, though more often than not the district boundaries were very blurry. Cupola District, for example, hosted the largest community of Srang expatriates on the planet. Inber, where she lived, was an upper-class residential district with secrets buried underneath. And Mok District, where she was heading, was famous for its wide variety of restaurants and cafes. Each had their own unique quirks and problems, but for every district somebody called it home. Well, except for Vern. Everyone hated Vern. Newfoundland was the crown jewel of the empire, and so the God Emperor himself would often visit to bask in its magnificence, as he put it. Its people came in all shapes and sizes, in all varieties and flavors. But even the advancement of technology couldn't stop people from grouping with who they knew, being fearful of other cultures, and being intolerant of tolerance. The city was a melting pot, and yet many a bar fight began over what colony people were from and why one was better than the other. That hadn't changed in millennia, and it would probably never change. She absent-mindedly wondered why people could be so bitter about something they had no control over. I never asked to be born in Newfoundland, to an imprisoned father and a mother who moved on. But it was the only city that Edelgard had ever known, and for that she was grateful. A utopia, the God Emperor called Newfoundland. And it might have very well been the closest thing to a utopia in the known universe, if not for what she knew. Not when people disappeared for saying the wrong things. Or the fact that she knew that the city was built on the suffering of other colonies. Or the web of corruption and lies that spread throughout the government and the magistrate, keeping the masses placated and unquestioning. Or that the outskirts of Newfoundland were hunting grounds for human experimentation. These people all counted on her. Edelgard clenched her fists, and willed herself to start walking again. And she would not let them down. Gareg Mok Cafe was a quite popular business, even compared to its counterparts in Newfoundland. Her favorite drink in the world was their specialty brand of coffee, imported all the way from the outer planet colony of Srang. Something about their cultivation techniques and the air, they said, gave it a unique blend of flavor and undertones. Edelgard didn't know much about that, all she knew was that it tasted way too good for what it was worth. Well, coffee was her favorite drink in the morning at least. She sat at the edge of the cafe, pretending to scroll through her holodisplay when instead she was indulging in one of her favorite pastimes, people watching. It was always fun to see what others came to the cafe for, not to mention one as popular and pricey as this one. There was that writer, with his antique silenced keyboard still clacking away at what might be the next great Fodlani novel. She spotted a cute couple, one in a hoodie and jeans, and the other in a pretty red dress, and probably also wore the pants of the relationship. There was. She paused to recall his name. Malok? The frumpy-looking man in khakis who always stuck out with the ladies. Yep, that was Malok all right. She hated the fact that she recognized him. And of course, in her peripheral vision she noticed a man in a suit sitting alone at a table, whose stocky build suggested that he probably wasn't working in the business sector and instead in a much more dangerous field. An agent of the magistrate. And if it wasn't clear, she could tell by his eyes, constantly flicking from table to table, carefully turning his head as to not arouse suspicion. He was well trained, and probably was just here to track down a tip or to make sure the people of the cafe behaved. She might have been afraid, if she had anything to hide. Today, however, she was Edelgard Eisner. It was like a switch. A day she would be shopping dresses and trying on clothing, making snide comments and shutting down unwanted advances as if it was second nature. It was easy to maintain her mask. She had done so for so long, hidden her true self both in university and in the dregs of high society she found her in. And at night all those thoughts vanished. The only thing she focused on was her plans, her subordinates, and her vengeance. It was quite the double life that she lived. Edelgard wondered which was the mask and which was the real her. She did enjoy being a vain socialite, caring about nothing and having all her needs met. In a peaceful world she'd probably be going to clubs, partying away her adolescence along with her friends. Yet there was something within her that refused to simply wither away and do nothing, and the same drive that drove her to become the Queen of Flames might be redirected toward more peaceful pursuits in a better world. And more troubling was the fact that she still felt a strange sense of apprehension every time she put the Queen's helmet on. Almost as if she was acting, putting on a performance to catch the eyes of the people and spark loyalty from her soldiers. She supposed that neither was the real her, and that they were both masks. The real her was Edelgard von Hresvelg, and that girl died 9 years ago. It was around 12:35 when Dorothea Arnault arrived, a bit earlier than Edelgard had expected considering she was pretty much always late. And she looked positively gorgeous. As usual. And it seemed so effortless, too. She wore a low-cut black top with purple accents, which extended into a short black skirt with leggings under. And though she had her trademark black cap, there was no hiding her wavy brown hair and her piercing gaze. Though she could see that Dorothea had put on a veritable regimen of makeup, she really didn't need it to showcase her beauty. Edelgard couldn't help but notice that people were staring at her companion, probably because she was famous and because she was an absolute knockout. Am I jealous? She asked herself. Or was that envy? Edie! Dorothea exclaimed, wrapping her friend into a hug. As she pulled away, however, she caught a glance of Edelgard's expression, smiling, but the kind of smile that didn't really reach the eyes. What's wrong? Edelgard realized that she must have been making a weird face, and so she immediately relaxed into a more genuine smile and tried to brush it off. Nothing, Dorothea. I'm just happy to see you, that's all, she said sheepishly. Dorothea raised an eyebrow. Edie, we've known each other for years. You can tell me, you know. The two of them were roommates back in university, so she supposed that they had known each other for quite a long time. She really didn't remember much from her classes there other than the veritable mess that was Newfoundland's politics and how to take the Cauchy integral of a contour. Edelgard had ended her unremarkable college career with a degree in military history and strategic intelligence, and while those classes held some value, they were marred by the tinted lens of the magistrate's worldview. They taught her exactly what they wanted her to learn, expecting her to join the Legion or serve as an operator. She had chosen to do neither. She simply lounged at home all day, or so everyone assumed. Ironically, it was a great cover story. No one suspected anything of the utterly unremarkable Edelgard Eisner, who coasted off her natural intelligence and rose to the top of the class only to do nothing. And so as Dorothea spent her time partying and writing songs in her dorm room, Edelgard had been planting the seeds for her rebellion for years. Dorothea often used the room for far more sordid purposes than she did, and so Edelgard had no complaint when she was forced out of her room and into the library. Professor Hanneman once caught her in the library dozing off and muttering about rats. She shuddered at the memory, and how he had laughed. If only he knew why she hated rats so much. On other nights, she chose to whack at a few of the training dummies until they were nothing but metal scraps. Everyone simply thought that she was training to be a better axe duelist, but she had no intentions of doing it professionally like some of the other members on her team. She trained to kill, which she had occasionally done by descending into abyss using the university's hidden entrance. But despite their differences in hobbies, the two girls were inseparable in their friendship. They would often grab meals together, explore the city, and even go partying when Edelgard felt like she really needed to go outside. She would listen to all of Dorothea's troubles and complaints, and in return Edelgard had emotional support and a steady presence in her life. There was an unbreakable bond between the two, and Edelgard was quite pleased when people referred to her as Dorothea's shadow and not as the premier ice queen of university. In addition, rooming with the most popular girl on campus meant that she had quite the social network to draw from. Whether she could convert that into allies of the Queen of Flames, however, was a different story altogether. There was one unspoken rule: never discuss their respective pasts, and never question what the other person did at night. She wondered if Dorothea knew what she was up to, or who she really was. But if she did, she was the best liar in Newfoundland, and so Edelgard continued her activities unabated. Edelgard rolled her eyes. "Well, it has nothing to do with love, so I suppose it really doesn't matter much to you," she said. "That's not true and you know it," replied Dorothea. "But if you don't want to talk about it, that's okay." She motioned a waiter to come over, doing her best to keep up with the social pleasantries her mother had taught them. The waiter blushed, probably from seeing her idol in the flesh, and jotted down their orders on his hollow pad. For Dorothea, it was a Caesar salad. For Edelgard, it was a mock burger and a double helping of fries, with some extra salt. Unfortunately, her augmentations had given her a voracious appetite for years, and people had often joked that she would probably win any eating contest she put her mind to. "I'm so jealous that you get to eat anything and keep that," said Dorothea. She gestured to her in an up-down motion, and Edelgard felt blood rush to her cheeks. "That good figure. Some people just have good genetics," she grumbled. "I have to eat so goddess damned healthy, and my trainer keeps me on a strict diet." "Oh, relax, Dorothea," she muttered. "I spend half my time exercising anyway. And I don't have to worry about a career as an idol," she added, as if to rub salt into the wound. Which was technically true, but it wasn't the real reason. "Exercising for what? You're not in the dueling circuit anymore. I get bored sometimes. But you are taking care of yourself, aren't you? In a manner of speaking." "Edie. What? You haven't been sleeping well, have you?" How could she tell? Did she not hide it well enough with makeup? Or was it her expression? Edelgard replied, "Not really." "Ugh, Edie, I told you that all that late night studying was gonna screw you up for years." She poked at her salad. "You probably need to work off some stress too." "I know where this is going," she groaned. "Clubbing. Again." "No, silly, you'd just say no 'cause you're boring." Edelgard laughed at that. "Anyway, have you at least been trying that perfume I gave you?" "Yes," Edelgard said, flicking a stray hair out of her vision. They were vain gifts for a vain girl, or at least, she would have to keep up the appearance of being a vain girl. The real Edelgard von Hresvelg did not care how she looked, or who she was trying to attract the attention of. Edelgard Eisner, however, had no such luxury. Her power came from her beauty and her wit. They were the things that made people listen to her, rather than the strength that ran in the blood of the Queen of Flames or the power that came from her heritage. And so she made a conscious effort to look presentable or even good. Having the heartthrob of Newfoundland as a friend certainly helped with that. "And has it worked on dates? Or even the bedroom?" Dorothea said with a mischievous grin. "Dorothea." She playfully hit Dorothea's arm. "You could at least beat around the bush a little. Is that a yes?" Edelgard couldn't recall the last time she had the company of a woman, ever since the blasted rebellion business began in earnest. Or a man, she mused, dimly recalling some poor judgment in college. There was just too much to do, too many sleepless nights, too much to explain to anybody. Her heart was hardened, and that was that she could not let anybody into her life, for fear of getting them hurt. But she knew that deep down, she yearned for more connections between people, meaningful ones that would stand the test of time. Edelgard scoffed. "I wish. You didn't even notice that I'm wearing it right now." "Oh. So is it working on you?" Edelgard said with a wry smile. "Edie." Now it was Dorothea's turn to give her a light smack on the elbow. But she was smiling and having a good time, and that was why Edelgard cherished her closest friend so much. Even if all she saw was just a surface impression, even though she doesn't know the terrible things I have done and that have been done to me and that I will do. A twinge of guilt remained in her heart, floating down and settling at its very bottom. But she couldn't show that side of her. Not to Dorothea. At least she deserved happiness, and it would not come from walking down the path of violence as Edelgard had already done. I'll take that as a no. What about you? She asked, eager to change the subject. Has anything been going on in your love life? Ha, ha, very funny, Edie. I don't suppose we could discuss that more privately. Edelgard chuckled. Dorothea Arnold had quite the reputation, especially as Newfoundland's new rising diva. Twice winner of the Adrestia Idol competition, and on track to eclipse her mentor Casagrande if the tabloids were correct. Any gossip would reflect poorly on her, even ignoring the fact that she had already gotten in trouble for the string of broken hearts she left behind. And, she thought, it would probably draw attention to me. Fair point. She paused and looked over her shoulders for any paparazzi. The coast seemed to be clear, and she didn't care enough to do a full sweep as she would have done with the Queen of Flames. "So, the Gautier guy?" she whispered. Dorothea laughed. "Oh, him. Let's see, he's childhood friends with Ingrid, a serial philanderer, and an asshole with a heart of gold under. Well, I can see him being a good friend. Would I date him? He's dash." Right here, a voice interrupted, and Edelgard did not recognize it at all. A man with messy orange hair and dressed in a white and blue button-down walked up behind Dorothea. There was something oddly familiar about him, and as Dorothea turned in surprise, he managed to kiss her on the cheek as a greeting. She certainly did keep odd company, Edelgard observed. But if she had any qualms about the man, she did not verbalize it, and so she remained quiet for the moment. "Sylvain," she said teasingly. "I really wasn't expecting you here. Just happened to stop by." "And who's the lovely company?" he asked. Edelgard resisted the urge to blush. She didn't take compliments too well, or at least, she enjoyed them a bit too much. Perhaps it stemmed from her past, the network of scars that ran across her body and made her feel as if she wasn't beautiful. But years of etiquette training and mask-wearing had allowed her to keep her composure, and so she kept her expression blank in front of Sylvain. "I'm Edelgard Eisner," she said icily. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "Oh, cool, cool. Well, Edelcakes," he said as she scowled, "the pleasure is all mine. Can I treat you to a drink sometime?" "No. And never call me Edelcakes again, if you know what's good for you." Sylvain, or at least that was what she thought his name was, gasped in fake horror. "You could at least pretend to think about it." Dorothea laughed, mirth shimmering over her visage. "Yeah, Sylvain does that." "Oh yeah, Edie, this is Sylvain." She gestured at the vaguely man-shaped hot mess that stood behind her. "Gautier, Eisner." "Eisner, Gautier." Edelgard forced herself to smile. Yep. That was definitely the Gautier boy. At least, she thought to herself, she could take a bit of pleasure in shooting him down each time. Chapter 5, A Dance with Death. By the time she finished shopping with the twin terrors that were Dorothea and Sylvain, the sun had already begun to dip below the horizon, and so Edelgard grabbed a quick sandwich from a nearby store and walked home alone. She walked past the Hresvelg Bridge, past the Fodland Park, and through in Bear District all the way back to her house carrying nothing but a few bags of clothing. Normally her mind would be racing with thoughts and schemes, but she felt strangely empty. Almost as if she was too tired to do anything. As she quickly slipped out of her outfit and into the bath her robo-butler had drawn for her, her eyelids felt heavier than usual. It wasn't that she was tired from shopping, she was tired from putting up an act the entire time. Meeting new people, enduring Sylvain's constant flirting, it was at least enjoyable to shoot him down each and every time. By the 10th time he had gotten the message, and so for their farewells he didn't even bother to try. Still, she was exhausted. Her augmented endurance did nothing when it came to her ability to socialize. Especially when it came to the two of them. Goddess, they talked a lot, and she was exhausted from their half-flirting and half-bickering. If they ended up together she wouldn't have been surprised, but she also wouldn't have been very surprised if they remained great friends. Edelgard cherished what little alone time she had by doing absolutely nothing. She gently dipped her body in, bubbles foaming in the water, and simply soaked in the gentle embrace of a warm bath. No thoughts, she reminded herself. After an hour or so of blissful silence in the bath, Edelgard decided that it was probably time to go back to work. It was just so nice, she mused, to do absolutely nothing and just relax. But all good things had to come to an end, so she pulled herself out of the bath, shivering from the cold as water dripped off her body. She grabbed a towel off the wall rack and dried herself off, making sure to gingerly dry out her hair. She put on some undergarments, grabbed her axe baton from the pile of laundry that her butler would pick up later, and slipped her feet into her favorite bunny slippers. She thought, as she walked out of the master bathroom. Perhaps a more tactical outfit would do for tonight? She tiptoed into her basement where her armory was, as the lights flickered on due to her presence. The main room was covered in carpet, and led to a small back room with nothing but bookshelves. She pulled on the loose book titled A History of Newfoundland, revealing a hidden iris scanner that she pressed her eye to. Once her identity was verified, she simply waited for the bookcase to lower itself into the ground and reveal a hidden passage. It was a bit cliché, but she knew that it was probably the least conspicuous hidden entrance she could make that she wouldn't simply forget about. The passage opened up into her personal armory, a small room filled with glass cases and holographic displays. The room was covered in reinforced Morphi's steel plating, and was both soundproofed and tech-proofed to make sure that no one could find it. On each of the four walls were different racks of weapons, each shielded in panels of hardened glass that opened up on command. Although she didn't have as many as she had in her hideout, Edelgard appreciated the collection of weapons she had racked up over the years. A couple low-tech swords dotted the right wall, and she was especially proud of the nano-etched saber that hung next to them. It glowed menacingly, and she recalled the Srang assassin she had dueled for it. A few spears and glaives were put up next to it, and she supposed she could take out one of the rocket spears for a whirl sometime. On her left was what she needed, her various suits and armors as the Queen of Flames. As she pressed her hand to the second cabinet, it whirred as the glass panels opened up to reveal a lightly armored black bodysuit. This one used blade-resistant fabrics so tightly woven they were more like metal plates, but still allowed for a wide variety of movement. It was a bit too tight for her liking and drew unwanted attention from the more lecherous of Newfoundland's underground, and so she usually wore a small black leather jacket over it. Besides, Abyss could get a little cold this time of year. With some effort, she slipped into her suit, zipping it up as the seals on her gloves hissed shut as to keep the suit completely airtight. She then put her feet into a pair of specially designed combat boots with daggers hidden in the solace. To hide her identity, she threw on a jacket with a hood and interfaced that with a vibromask. The mask was simply a projected image that hid her face in shadow, and thus lacked a physical component. This allowed her to talk and eat freely, though she made liberal use of a voice changer to obfuscate her identity a little. In her business, it paid to be a little paranoid, and Edelgard was nothing but paranoid. And with that, Edelgard put on yet another mask, as she pretended to be just another wandering mercenary consigned to the depths of Abyss. With a tap of the holodeck attached to her right gauntlet, two trapdoors opened up in front of her, revealing stairs that seemed to go down forever. When she purchased the house, one of the first things she considered was its proximity to an Abyss entrance, and she knew a private passageway would be priceless. Though it was a security risk, both the demolition charges she buried around the entrance and the blast door at the base meant that entrance from the Abyss side was unlikely. In order to build all of this, she had purchased a very expensive robotics construction crawler meant for industrial use in tight spaces. Its rugged yellow exterior and 8 legs made it look like a spider, using 4 to stabilize itself and 4 to build using an arsenal of tools hidden within each arm. When fed a schematic, it would carefully carve out enough space and then lay down whatever material was needed from its cargo bay. She had taken a couple classes in urban design and functional architecture, and with some input from Linhard the crawler had built her armory, the stairway to Abyss, and her subway hideout with a small fortune's worth of building material. Of course, the little details were worked out later on, and so once the robot's job was completed she crushed its memory disk to prevent any schematics leaking. Edelgard took a deep breath, and began her descent down the seemingly never-ending staircase. Down, 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 into the Abyss. The Abyss of Newfoundland was one of the largest systems of man-made tunnels on the planet. Technically it had been mapped decades ago, but by now the magistrate had made so many side tunnels with tunnel borecraft and collapsed so many others that the map was completely off. The only people that knew how to navigate the tunnels were the old order of wayfinders, who used sonar pinging devices to reconstruct temporary maps and would help you navigate through for a price. It had to do with something about the type of bedrock Newfoundland was built on disrupting other forms of signal, and if she had been paying attention in geology class, she would know. Communication was done through several relays on the main routes, though the branching tunnels often were completely removed from the rest of the world communication-wise. House Hresvelg once had a secret controlling stake in the machines that bored tunnels, and thus each and every major pathway in Abyss was catalogued in the vast Hresvelg subnet. It was trivial for Edelgard to access them, though to do so discreetly required the help of Bernadetta. But each time a tunnel was collapsed and drilled out, she would not know, and so she made an effort to collect data using some of her subordinates or through exchanging information with the man known as the Savage Mockingbird. Wayfinders were dead. It was now a matter of who had the most information. For the Queen of Flames, it was a life or death matter. If she got lost, she was good as dead, and she often used branching tunnels and hidden intersections to evade her pursuers or set up an ambush. Even the enforcers didn't have as clear of a map as she did, though it would be years until she managed to fully map out the underground. While the name of Abyss suggested large rocky tunnels prone to collapse, in reality the machinery meant to dig also provided the infrastructure for an actual tunnel. Once the tunnel bore dug into the bedrock, it laid down steel plating to serve as walls, along with self-sustaining lighting and a ventilation system above. The bottom was reserved for long wires and cables, covered up by thick concrete that served as a floor. Intersections and loops were common, along with different layers that sloped gently up and down. It was a complete nightmare navigation-wise, and so even the enforcers barely traveled outside of a few high-traffic main tunnels. She made sure to avoid the more popular ones. They were frequented by cargo transports, and seeing a rogue mercenary walk next to a cargo transport was how one got detained. Thus she stuck to the side tunnels that she knew, and though they were often not as ventilated or even as well lit, they tended to be far safer. She had been riding her hoverbike through the tunnels for a few minutes, as her visor plotted the easiest path to her destination that wouldn't intersect with the enforcers and their usual routes of choice. Her hoverbike was usually parked behind the concealed blast doors that led up to her armory, and Edelgard was lucky that the nest of tunnels leading to her house tended to be dense enough to scare away any would-be pursuers. She didn't like walking much in Abyss. Doing so invited an attack by other mercenaries, or even being assaulted by enforcers for suspicious activity. And then there were the rumors an armored man who roamed the tunnels of Abyss, looking to slaughter whoever he got his hands on. There was also the legend of the Manbot, a massive winged beast who craved the blood of man. At first Edelgard thought the last one was a joke, until she saw the magistrate's experiments firsthand. She shivered at the memory. At an intersection she took a hard right, the fabric of her hood flapping in the artificial wind as she leaned into the turn. But faintly, over the rhythmic pulsing of the grav engine, she heard it. Screams. Bloody and guttural. The distinct sound of death. Edelgard drove a little forward until the sounds grew louder, and pulled her bike to a stop. She parked it in a side tunnel and activated its anti-theft measures before beginning to walk slowly to the source of the screaming. Her right hand instinctively flicked to her axe hanging from her utility belt. Its shape felt almost reassuring, as she quieted her breathing and footsteps. She kept walking. Had the tunnel always been this long? Once she got to the four-way intersection at the end of the tunnel, Edelgard paused. The screaming stopped. Instead, she heard the scraping of metal to her left, and so she moved into the tunnel on her left. And before she knew it, she stumbled upon a crime scene right out of the flames of Alel. On the concrete floor, there were bodies. Many of them, each donning the distinctive white and blue uniforms of enforcers. Blood pooled on the floor, trickling from their bodies and covering the once gray floor in red. But it was the bodies themselves that disturbed her. They had been savaged, almost as if a wild beast had tore through them. Though the wounds were cauterized on the bodies, probably due to a heat weapon, they were numerous enough to know that this was not a fight gone wrong. This was a slaughter. There had to be at least a dozen of them. Men were cut in half, their limbs splayed out in odd angles. She tried not to focus on their torsos, or what was left of them. Edelgard was not the squeamish girl she once was, but she did not like to revel in gore. Or at least, she was not in the mood to do so at the moment. The body of a woman lay slumped against the wall, her own weapon embedded deep into her chest. Another was missing a head, and she did not want to look for where it had went. Then she saw what was presumably the culprit. He was wiping the blood off his sword with his metal gauntlets, and that was what had caused the scraping noise. Even a heated weapon was still prone to staining, and his massive scythe lacked a characteristic orange glow as he cleaned it. He was clad in almost medieval armor from head to toe, black plates and bone-like spikes jutting out from his arms in tassel. The quiet but noticeable sound of mechanical whirring meant that this was most definitely a powered suit, and she noticed a small glowing object embedded in his breastplate. Behind him, the tattered remnants of a red cape fluttered. But it was his mask that bothered her. It was a skull-like shape with garish teeth, along with massive horns that jutted out in front. His eyes glowed a terrifying shade of red, and as they looked at her, Edelgard's blood ran cold. The Death Knight himself, she thought. Or, at least that was the name that came to her mind. There was something oddly familiar about him. I see that another has come to lose their life, he rumbled. It was a guttural voice, multi-layered with hints of the real voice peeking through the voice filter. And there was an undeniable haughtiness in his tone, almost as if she was beneath him. Or was it even a him at all? I don't plan on dying today, she replied in an ice-cold tone. That is what these men said, and look at them now. Her eyes flicked to the bodies that lay before her. Face me, or flee. Your fate is the same regardless. With a flourish of his right wrist, his scythe flared to life, orange illuminating the massive blade and giving his armor an otherworldly glow. Around it, the air shimmered from the heat, as if it was piercing the air itself. He raised his weapon at Edelgard in a clear challenge. Only one word needed to be said, so Edelgard quickly whipped out her axe and let it unfold in front of her, as the metal parts clicked into place. Engage, she whispered, and both Hallok's blades flared to life. She brought it to her side, switching to a combat stance. It was times like this that she wished she had her projector shield on her left arm, but that was on her other armor, and she cursed her poor judgment. They stood there for a moment, sizing each other and the battlefield up. The tunnel was no more than a dozen meters across, and so there wasn't much space to maneuver. While she had enough space to swing her axe, the large size of the knight's scythe might prove his downfall in combat. If she could force him against a wall, perhaps she could. Before she had time to make a good combat plan, he closed the distance so fast that she had barely time to blink. She caught the first sweeping strike with the haft of her axe, only to have him twirl it around and come in for a second hit. This she dodged by the skin of her teeth by leaping to her left, and responded in turn by slashing at his breastplate. It barely missed, and so she feinted a low attack and then lurched forward to cleave his helmet in two. This one he caught with his own handle, between his double-handed grip, and while she was trying to get better leverage he shifted his grip and brought the edge of the scythe dangerously close to her side. Edelgard yelped as the blade tapped her side, just barely missing her ribcage and all of her vital organs. It swung back in as she pulled back her axe, and she took a moment to vault backwards and reassess the situation. The knight mused. Perhaps you will be a fight worthy of the Death Knight. He started to walk toward her, dragging his scythe on the floor and leaving a groove in the concrete. Edelgard's mind raced. Perhaps a distraction? Or using the hidden dagger? Or... The scythe came down once more, and so she dodged with a quick sidestep and swung at him with her axe. The blow wasn't too quick, but as he twisted the scythe around she used her free hand to grab it, redirecting its path and causing him to temporarily lose its grip. As he struggled to get control, she lunged forward and slashed with all her might at his chest. She managed to score a decent hit, but it wasn't enough. Edelgard had gouged a deep groove into his breastplate, but not enough to expose the flesh underneath. In addition, the shining light in his armor, presumably the power source, remained untouched despite a direct hit. The suit, she thought, was the key. Perhaps she should attack the joints? Or maybe the wiring, leave him stranded in an unmoving suit. With a roar, the Death Knight resumed his offensive as he shifted his grip to his right hand. This allowed for a longer reach, but reduced his striking power and stability. If that scythe fell out of his hands, it was game over. His first strike soared over her head, a wide arc that forced his whole body to turn with it. And as he turned around once more, he raised the scythe and tried to bring it down on Edelgard's head. She blocked with the flat of her axe blade, and now her right shoulder was starting to ache. The suit multiplied his skill, and the sheer impact of even a blocked blow was brutal enough to make her stagger a bit. It was that brief moment of hesitation that allowed the scythe to come down next to her, and as she tried to rush in for a attack he instead brought the scythe slightly to the side. Slightly to the side. Under her guard. Her body instinctively lurched to dodge right, but it was too late as he twisted his strike and brought the toe of his scythe into her side. Her body had moved without thinking, and so she managed to avoid it disemboweling her, but it was a deep enough cut to make every part of her body howl in pain. The searing blade met some resistance due to her bodysuit, but enough of it cut through and cauterized her flesh that she screamed in pain. He pulled the scythe back, and though she had moved fast enough to save her life, the cut was still deep. The entire left side of Edelgard's body howled with pain. She felt something warm and sticky on her left side, as the area around her wound went numb. Whether from shock or singed nerves she had no clue, but she knew that she would die without help, and a cold feeling worked its way through her body. Though her insides still remained intact, the wound was too deep to be left untreated. As she swept her axe in a wide arc to buy her some distance, she steadied herself and put her left hand to her torso. It came back bloody. "A good fight," the Death Knight growled. He studied her like a hunter studying its prey, relishing in her last moments. His scythe hung menacingly at his side, her blood dripping and steaming from the heated edge. Her blood. No doubt he enjoyed the slaughter and the thrill of battle. "Now it is time for you to die." But Edelgard von Hresvelg was not ready to die just yet. With a sudden rush of energy and a desperate shout, she rushed forward with her axe to deliver a devastating blow. The Death Knight was caught off guard at his would-be victim's tenacity, and barely had time to block with his scythe. But now that he was only using one hand, his block was much weaker than it was before. With her bloodied hand she gripped her axe with both hands and slammed it toward him once more before he had time to adjust his grip. The edge of the axe inched closer and closer toward his head, and now that she was close enough to feel his breath on her face she realized just how tall the Death Knight was. She was pushing up against the Death Knight, pushing downward, and with each pained effort she pushed her axe closer and closer to his face. It would only take a little more, as he tried to regain control of the situation by gripping his scythe with both hands. And that was exactly what she had been hoping for. She brought the axe down hard on the handle, and her axe cleaved right through. Though it missed his chest, it took a large chunk out of his right gauntlet, and she swore she saw blood trickling onto his armor. But if it was hers or his, Edelgard couldn't exactly tell. But now that his scythe had been forcibly shortened, she could now go on the offensive and. "In the name of the God Emperor, halt!" The Death Knight took advantage of the distraction and pushed her off him with his right hand. She flew a bit backward, and barely had time to steady herself against the side of the tunnel before she realized what was happening. She could afford one glance to see what was behind her. And in her peripheral vision she saw a fully armored squad of 24 enforcers, weapons drawn and marching toward her and the Death Knight. This was the worst possible time, though it had granted her a momentary reprieve. Having a third foe would only complicate things. And in her state, she could barely fight one at a time. Yet although she fully expected him to take advantage of the chaos and strike, instead, the Death Knight bowed. "I suppose it is time to take my leave," he rumbled. "We will cross blades again." And with that, he marched off into the darkness, and all she could hear was his suit whirring and his heavy footsteps fading away into the abyss. That left her to stare down the squadron of Imperial enforcers who had just seen her inside a tunnel filled with the corpses of their fellow soldiers. Not exactly the most ideal of situations. The head enforcer wore no helmet. Instead, his short purple hair and stern expression made him instantly distinguishable from the faceless subordinates she fought every day. The badge of a captain hung on his right breast, and his right eye was covered by a hollow lens. This must have been the man giving orders, she thought. "Butcher," he spat. "How could you?" By now the pain was starting to hit, because Edelgard was beginning to see spots dance in the edges of her vision. But she bit her lip so hard that blood began to trickle down her chin, and stood to fully face the captain. "I," she said in a quiet but stern voice, "was not the one responsible for this slaughter." "Bullshit," somebody shouted. "Why should we believe anything like you from a filthy mercenary?" shouted one of the men. "Quiet, Striga," snapped the captain. Let's hear her out before we kill her. Interesting. So he wasn't just an unfeeling robot or a corrupt soldier like most enforcers, there was something behind that thick skull of his. Wise choice, Captain. Tell me, are you an honorable man? I am a Frildarius after all, of course I am. Frildarius? Like the securities company? Then you should know, she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper now, that the man responsible is walking into the tunnels ahead of us right now. You'd be a fool to think I was the one responsible. She couldn't see behind her, but she assumed that the Death Knight had just started walking away. And though she hated even entertaining the idea of speaking to an enforcer, the truth was that even she could not condone the senseless slaughter of men. They barely had time to react before they were set upon from something straight of the flames of Alel. She still heard their guttural screams, their pitiful cries, their last whimpers, as the last thing they ever saw was the downward slash of a scythe. These people had families, wives, husbands, sons, daughters. And all it took was a single madman to snuff their lights out. Captain Frildarius, she assumed, had to have been a reasonable man. She wasn't sure why she trusted him, almost as if she had seen his face somewhere before. Her instincts were usually correct, but now she wondered. For a moment, he paused, and Edelgard felt her heart drop. Then he spoke. I believe you. Edelgard nearly did a double take in surprise. But, he said, drawing his sword, the magistrate needs a head regardless. His men began to surge forward, as he walked toward Edelgard with his sword in hand. She saw his firm gaze, as he steeled himself to do what needed to be done. They weren't about to go home empty-handed. I'm sorry, he finished. I promise I'll take you in if you lay down your weapons. Shit. They were closing in, no more than 10 meters away. Edelgard weighed her options quickly as she stood there, frozen in indecisiveness. If she fought, she would probably manage to kill them all, but she would bleed out in the process and die. And if she simply ran, they would give chase and hunt her down. Or maybe the Death Knight would turn around and finish her off, treating it as a mercy. She needed a distraction. Her hands closed around something on her utility belt. Yes. This would do. I have no wish to kill you today, she said with the last bit of steely defiance that remained. Take the bodies of those men and give them the proper burial that they deserve. The captain paused. His gaze went to the bodies strewn across the tunnel, and then to her. Kill us? You're in no position to make such claims. And he was right. I am tired of bloodshed. Do not mistake that for mercy. And with that, Edelgard grabbed a small metal canister from her utility belt and smashed it on the floor. It erupted into thick, black smoke, and as the captain and his men began coughing, she began to run to safety. Her footsteps felt heavy, and the sounds rang out throughout the tunnel as she desperately tried to get away. Everything burned. She felt the wound in her side getting worse, even if her augments had provided her with a mild regenerative factor. It was the heat that did so, cauterizing her flesh and burning off her nerve endings. Her left hand was soaked in blood as she clutched her left side, trying to put some pressure on the wound so that she wouldn't bleed out. Even as she ran, she was moving at half her normal pace, and her visor plotted a path back to her hoverbike. It was a clever ruse. They would chase down the tunnel looking for which way she had gone, when in reality she would double back in a parallel tunnel and end up back where she had stashed her hoverbike. And as long as she was careful not to drip blood onto the floor, they had no way of tracking her. Though she heard the frenzied shouts of the enforcers, she managed to get back to where she had hidden her hoverbike, bringing it out of its camouflage. She struggled to even get on, and now her handlebar was soaked in blood. Her vision began to become blurry, and her bike was moving on autopilot as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Plotting a path to Mercedes's clinic, said a distant voice. She couldn't even react to that statement as the bike began to shoot forward at dangerously fast speeds. Her left hand clutched her wound for dear life while her right one held onto the handlebar so hard her knuckles turned white. Her consciousness ebbed, and she began to see things that weren't really there. Her mother's voice. Calm and soothing, comforting her. Everything was gonna be all right, she said. And never lose sight of your heart, Elle. No matter what happens. She remembered her mother gently smoothing her forehead, the sensation of her warm hand over her brow. She tried to remember what Mother's face looked like, how beautiful yet regal her expression was, but all she could imagine was her own wretched visage. She heard Dimma's voice. He nagged, the sun's going down. Let's go back to Mother. She heard him laugh about how he had tripped her, and made her step on her dress before she kicked him playfully. She heard him giggle when she told him about the weird boy she had made friends with at school. She listened to him whine about being trapped in a strange underground room with no access to the net. She heard his screams as they experimented on him, did things that should never be done to another human, let alone an 13-year-old boy. His screams rang out in her ears again and again and again and again. A strange voice, one that was both confident yet alluring. It whispered sweet nothings to her, that everything was going to be okay in the end. My teacher, she thought numbly, my teacher has returned to me. She saw her face, beautiful with doe eyes and a blank expression. Dark turquoise hair cascaded over her shoulders, covering shoulder pauldrons. Her chest was covered by a black breastplate and some sort of insignia, as the metal curved gently with her bust. But most importantly of all, she could hear her heartbeat, the one that Emperor Edelgard von Hresvelg had fought so hard for. To hear that beat once more was all she wanted. And then she heard the laughter. A vicious cackle, with no mirth and only malice underneath. It could be no other than Volkhard von Arundel. No, that wasn't it. Thales. Here to mock her again. As he did in every world. The one thing she had promised herself was that one day she would make that laughter stop. And before she would break him. Slowly. Painfully. The very last thing Edelgard saw before she passed out entirely was a very confused-looking woman with flowing blonde hair, her gentle features contorted in worry. Don't worry, Edelgard. We're gonna get you help, okay? The world faded to black, and Edelgard was alone once more. Check the description for the links to the author.